They hunted in silence, beneath the black surface of the Atlantic, in the cold and crushing dark, where the sun never reached, and the line between life and death was measured in meters and minutes. They were the U-boat aces, Germany's elite submarine captains, men who became legends in their own time, heroes of a nation and executioners of the sea. To the surface world, they were unseen. To the sailors of the Allied convoys, they were a nightmare without a face. Between 1939 and 1943, their names echoed through the Kriegsmarine and across Europe. Prien, Kretschmer, Top, Luth, Hardigan, and Merton. Young men commanding steel predators that brought the world's greatest shipping empire to its knees. In the early years of World War II, they were celebrated like knights of an ancient order. Their victories announced by radio, their portraits framed in honor, their deeds woven into the myth of invincibility. But beneath the medals and propaganda lay a world of claustrophobia, fear, and endurance, where every breath might be your last, and every triumph came with the knowledge that the ocean was watching, waiting to take you. When the Second World War began, Admiral Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat fleet, understood what few others did, that the fate of nations could be decided not on land, but in the deep. Germany could not challenge the Royal Navy ship for ship. Instead, it would strangle Britain's lifelines, cutting off food, oil, and weapons from across the Atlantic. The U-boat captains became his instrument, wolves unleashed upon the convoy routes that fed the Allied war effort. They were trained in precision, patience, and ruthlessness. Their battlefield was invisible, their victories heard only through distant explosions and coded signals. In those early years, they struck without mercy, and the Atlantic burned with the oil of sunken tankers. Britain teetered on the edge of starvation, and the world held its breath as the ocean turned into a graveyard of ships. Each U-boat ace was a study in contrast, brilliant tacticians, audacious leaders, yet ordinary men shaped by extraordinary times. Günther Prien, the bull of Scapa Flow, made history by infiltrating Britain's most secure naval base and sinking HMS Royal Oak beneath the noses of the Royal Navy. His daring made him a national icon overnight, a symbol of Germany's early triumphs. Otto Kretschmer, calm and methodical, became known as Silent Otto for his uncanny ability to strike without warning and vanish before the enemy knew he was there. He was the deadliest U-boat commander of them all, sinking over 200,000 tons of Allied shipping. Eric Top, the youngest of the great captains, combined intellect with instinct. His boat, U-552, the infamous Red Devil, left a trail of destruction across the Atlantic. Each man commanded not just a vessel, but a crew bound by trust and terror, living days or weeks at a time, in air so thick it stank of oil, sweat, and fear. Life aboard a U-boat was a world of extremes. The space was so tight that men slept beside torpedoes. The air grew stale within hours of diving. Food spoiled, metal sweated with condensation, and the constant thrum of engines mixed with the distant, haunting pings of sonar. When depth charges fell, the sea became a cathedral of sound, thunder above, crushing silence below. The men would hold their breath, feeling the pressure plates creak, hearing bolts twist under strain, waiting for the next explosion that might end it all. And through it all, the captain, the Calhoun, stood calm at the periscope, eyes fixed on the horizon, heart trained to stay steady even as death closed in. To be a U-boat ace was not just to command steel, it was to master fear itself. For the Allies, these men were phantoms, unseen executioners who struck in the night. The convoys, escorted by destroyers and corvettes, fought back with sonar, depth charges, and radar. Yet the ocean was vast, and the hunters were patient. The aces played their deadly game with skill and calculation, turning the Atlantic into the most dangerous battlefield of the war. But as the tide turned in 1943, technology and tactics caught up. Long-range aircraft closed the Atlantic gap. New sonar systems revealed the ghosts below. And with each passing month, the hunters became the hunted. The same men once hailed as heroes found themselves trapped beneath the waves, their radios silent, their legends sinking with them. By war's end, of the 40,000 men who served aboard U-boats, more than 30,000 were lost. Their graves remain at the bottom of the sea, cold, dark, and eternal. Yet the legacy of the U-boat aces endures, not in glory, but in complexity. They were products of a regime that exalted them as symbols of German might, yet they were also sailors, men bound by comradeship, by skill, by a strange respect for the sea and their enemies. Their courage was real, even when their cause was not. They lived on the edge of existence, guided by duty, consumed by fate. In their story lies the paradox of war itself. Brilliance born of madness, bravery chained to tragedy. Tonight we dive once more into those dark waters, through the silent depths and echoing sonar, through victory and loss, through the faces of the men who defied the ocean and paid the ultimate price. This is the entire history of the U-boat aces, Germany's top submarine captains, the silent hunters who turned the Atlantic into a graveyard, and whose stories still whisper beneath the waves. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? In the final quiet of 1918, when the guns at last fell silent, a different kind of silence spread across the waters. The North Sea lay cold and heavy, its surface smooth as glass, while deep below, the iron hulls of submarines rested like sleeping giants. These were Germany's U-boats, once feared across the oceans, now stripped of purpose and surrendering to stillness. Their crews had returned home, hollow-eyed and uncertain, carrying memories of endless patrols and whispered orders. The war that had driven them into the depths was over, and the empire they served was gone. In harbours once alive with noise, only gulls and the wind remained. The ocean, which had been a battleground, had turned into a quiet graveyard. Salt and rust began their patient work. The men who built them could only watch, forbidden from dreaming of the deep again. And yet, in that hush, the water seemed to breathe, as if remembering. The sea held its secrets, waiting for someone to listen once more. At Scapa Flow, a great harbour in the Orkney Islands, the defeated German fleet lay anchored under British watch. Rows of U-boats and battleships floated in silence, their flags lowered, their engines forever quiet. Their crews were prisoners now, living among the ghosts of their own machines. On a grey morning in June 1919, as fog drifted across the bay, an order was whispered among them. A final act of defiance. One by one, the valves were opened, and cold seawater rushed inside the iron hulls. Men stood on deck and watched as the ocean swallowed what once was their pride. The ships sank slowly, bow first, their steel groaning like tired beasts. The surface rippled, then calmed, as though nothing had ever happened. Above, the gulls continued their cries, unaware that history had just slipped beneath their wings. Beneath the waves, the first chapter of the deep had ended. But endings, like tides, are never truly final. In the towns along Germany's coast, the silence of defeat was heavy. The war had taken not only men, but purpose. Shipyards that once rang with the sound of hammer and steel were empty now, their tools hanging like relics of another world. The Treaty of Versailles forbade the building of submarines, forbade even the thought of such things. For a nation that had built its hope upon the sea, it was a wound that reached deep. Yet among the engineers and sailors who had lived their lives by the tide, there lingered a quiet restlessness. They could not speak of it, but it lived in their hearts. The rhythm of the engines, the memory of the deep. The sea, after all, was not something one could forget. It returned in dreams, in the sound of the wind through the harbour masts. In that silence something unspoken began to stir again. It began not with a plan, but with a memory. The ocean has always been a place of memory, holding fragments of every story cast upon it. When the U-boats sank, they did not vanish. They became part of that vast living archive. Divers who would one day descend to those depths would find them preserved in the cold, their names still etched upon the plates, their logbooks sealed within rust. But in 1919, those who had built them could only imagine the darkness below, where their creations rested in peace. Many of these men had lost friends inside those same hulls, yet they spoke of them with reverence, not grief. For them the sea was both enemy and friend, punisher and protector. It had taken much, but it had also given meaning to their lives. Even in defeat they could not resent it. The waves outside the harbours still called softly, like an old song that refuses to fade. And somewhere beneath those waves the song was answered. Winter came again to Germany's coastlines. The wind blew from the north, carrying with it the smell of salt and iron. Life went on. Fishermen repaired their nets. Shipwrights turned to mending trawlers and cargo boats. Yet beneath the rhythm of daily labour was an unspoken yearning, a longing for the hum of engines and the deep pulse of the ocean floor. In quiet workshops, draftsmen sketched shapes they could not admit to, submarine hulls hidden beneath the outlines of research vessels, blueprints labelled as scientific projects that no one dared question. What was forbidden by treaty survived instead in secrecy, like embers beneath ash. The men who once commanded beneath the sea still met quietly, sharing stories of past patrols as if recalling dreams. To the outside world they seemed ordinary again, but the sea has a way of calling its own back, and the call of the deep was patient. Those who had served in the Great War's underwater battles often spoke of silence, not the silence of peace, but of pressure. The sound of water pressing against steel, the slow drip of condensation in the dark. It was in that silence that they found purpose. Now on land, silence felt different. It was hollow, without weight. The ports of Wilhelmshaven, Kiel, and Hamburg felt smaller somehow, as if the world itself had contracted. Yet for some, that stillness became a space to dream. If Germany could not build openly, then perhaps it could prepare quietly. The ocean, after all, never judged. It only waited. And so, in the calm after defeat, the next tide was already turning. Far from the coast, in Berlin's government halls, the new republic struggled to stand. Politics fractured like ice in spring. But beneath the confusion, former naval officers wrote letters, arranged meetings, and spoke in coded words about the future. Dönitz was among them, young still, but already obsessed with the precision of underwater warfare. To him, submarines were not just weapons. They were the embodiment of German discipline and endurance. The Navy could be reborn, he believed, not with noise, but with patience. His ideas would find their way, quietly, through the years that followed. As the world turned its gaze away, thinking the danger had passed, Germany began to dream once more beneath the surface. The sea, that eternal accomplice, whispered only one word to those who still listened. Wait. By the end of the decade, the memory of the Great War had faded into the background of daily life. Children played on the beaches where wreckage once washed ashore. The world, weary of conflict, began to rebuild. But under the calm surface of peace, the story of the U-boats was far from finished. Those who remembered the depths carried their secrets like lanterns in the dark. They knew that history, like the tide, always returns. Beneath the waters of Scapa flow, the old hulls rested still, coated in rust and silence. Yet in their stillness, something endured, an idea waiting for breath again. The world believed it had seen the end of submarine warfare, but the deep, eternal and unjudging knew better. For in the quiet heart of the sea, the next chapter was already rising. The ghost fleet of Kiel. In the quiet years that followed the Great War, the harbour city of Kiel carried the smell of salt and secrecy. The air was heavy with coal dust and mist, as if even the wind knew to speak softly there. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from building submarines, yet the memory of them lingered in every dock and every workshop. Men who had once worn naval uniforms now worked under new titles: engineers, mechanics, draftsmen. They built merchant ships, research vessels and trawlers, all under the careful eye of foreign inspectors. But within the hum of the factories, something unspoken moved like a tide beneath the surface. Notes were exchanged quietly, designs hidden within others, symbols that only the initiated could read. Each rivet and beam carried a second purpose, invisible to those who did not know where to look. Germany was disarmed only in appearance. Beneath the surface of peace, the navy was dreaming again. And in that dream, steel began to whisper once more. Kiel had always been a city bound to the sea. Even when the docks stood empty, its people listened for the echo of ship horns that once shook the morning fog. The war had left them weary, but not broken. They worked for bread, but they built for pride. Beneath the ordinary rhythm of life, the ringing of hammers, the turning of gears, a quiet defiance took root. Engineers who once designed torpedo tubes now tested ventilation systems. Naval officers became fisheries consultants. It was a delicate game of language and deception, played not for rebellion but for survival. The inspectors from abroad saw nothing unusual. The reports were clean, the ledgers proper, yet each blueprint that passed through those workshops carried a shadow of something greater. It was the shape of a promise, hidden beneath the shape of a ship. In those years, the men who had once served under the Imperial Navy met in taverns dimly lit by oil lamps. They spoke in low tones, remembering the comrades they had lost, the voyages they could never speak of. Outside, the rain would fall against the windows, a soft percussion that matched the rhythm of their thoughts. These were not conspirators in the modern sense. They were sailors without a sea. For them the ocean was both memory and destiny, and to be kept from it was a kind of exile. The beer was bitter, the air thick with smoke, and yet beneath it all there was warmth. The warmth of those who shared the same forbidden dream. One would bring a sketch rolled tightly under his coat, another a letter from a friend in Holland. Slowly, carefully, ideas began to pass between them. Germany's navy would live again, they whispered, only this time it would learn from the shadows. And shadows, when patient, can become foundations. The world beyond Germany's borders believed the nation was contained. Foreign powers were weary of war and eager for trade. They welcomed German engineers to shipyards abroad, never suspecting the true purpose behind those exchanges. In Holland, Spain, and Finland, German minds lent their talents to foreign submarine projects, studying, improving, remembering, under neutral flags, they tested new hull designs and propulsion systems. What was forbidden at home was reborn in secret across the continent. In a small Dutch town, a company called Ingenieurs Kantor voor Sheepsbow was founded, a bland name for what was, in truth, the heart of Germany's hidden submarine program. It built commercial vessels, yes, but its blueprints bore the unmistakable shape of predators. The world saw commerce, the sea saw something else, and quietly, the first ghosts began to take form. Back in Kiel, the workshops continued to hum. The workers came and went, their faces weathered by salt and wind, their hands dark with grease. To outsiders, it was an ordinary shipyard, but those who belonged to it knew that every bolt turned was an act of devotion. They remembered the scuttled fleet at Scapa Flow, the day the sea swallowed their pride. Now, each stroke of a hammer was an answer to that loss. Under the pretense of rebuilding the fishing industry, they built hulls capable of something far more. They experimented with streamlining, pressure-resistant rivets, and quiet-running propellers. The designs were stored carefully, disguised as academic reports or trade documentation, and when foreign inspectors walked through the halls, the workers smiled politely, saying little. For in silence, the future was being forged. The city itself began to change, though quietly. Warehouses were built with extra rooms that no one entered. Certain doors were kept locked, their keys held by men who wore no uniforms but carried the air of command. Blueprints moved through the docks under night fog, sealed in crates, labeled maintenance supplies. It was a theater of illusion, where every act of defiance was hidden beneath an act of compliance. The local fishermen knew something stirred in their harbor, but they said nothing. The tide carried whispers, as it always does, and sailors learn early not to question the tide. For most it was enough to know that Germany's spirit had not drowned with its ships. Even when hope seemed distant, the rhythm of hammers and waves reminded them that nothing is ever truly gone. The deep was still listening, and the deep rewards those who listen back. As the 1920s drew on, a new generation came of age in the shipyards. They had never seen war, but they had inherited its silence. For them, the ocean was not a memory, it was a calling waiting to be understood. Older men taught them in whispers, passing down lessons of navigation, stealth, and endurance. What had been lost in treaties was preserved in stories. Late at night, when the wind died down and the harbor lay still, the old sailors would stand by the docks and look out toward the horizon. One day, they would murmur, "The wolves will swim again." The young men didn't always understand, but the word stayed with them. It was less a prophecy than a promise, one that time itself seemed to honor. And in the silence between tides, the next generation began to listen. By the early 1930s, the illusion of peace was thinning. Germany's politics grew restless, and new voices spoke of strength and destiny. The old officers, who had waited patiently in the shadows, began to surface once more. Their designs were ready, their plans complete. The world, preoccupied with its own troubles, barely noticed when shipyard contracts began to multiply. Kiel's harbor, once silent, stirred with a familiar rhythm. The sound of hammers returned, this time louder, bolder, and without disguise. The ghosts that had haunted the city for 15 years were no longer hiding, they were becoming real again. And from that awakening would rise something even greater, the birth of the U-boot. When the year turned and new men filled the halls of power, the rhythm of the shipyards shifted almost imperceptibly, like a tide changing direction beneath a calm surface. Factories that had hummed with quiet work now began to pulse with purpose. Orders arrived, materials flowed, and the sound of rivets returned to the docks. For many who lived by the water, the change felt like the beginning of spring after a long winter. Hopeful, urgent, and a little frightening, the city streets filled again with uniforms, and the harbour lights stayed on longer into the night, as if to watch the horizon more closely. There was talk in cafes and under awnings about work returning, about steady wages, about the pride of craft renewed. Yet beneath those practical talks, something else moved, a rekindling of appetite for strength that wore the bright face of industry and the darker shadow of power. Men who had learned to hide their knowledge during lean years now found it permitted, even encouraged, to speak of ship designs and naval strategy. The world beyond the harbour read the outward signs as simple recovery, but the men at the slips felt the deeper current, and the harbour listened, as if holding its breath. The transformation from quiet rebuilding to overt rearmament did not happen overnight, but its pattern was clear. Laws and treaties were bent, and the tone of diplomacy shifted to accommodation. The Treaty of Versailles still sat like an old fragile map in people's pockets, but a new agreement in 1935 would alter the coastline of possibility and allow Germany to reshape its fleet in ways once forbidden. That accord eased restrictions and permitted the Navy to grow to a fraction of the Royal Navy's tonnage, a political opening that felt like permission to breathe again. Shipyards that had kept to the rhythms of repair and commerce now received new commissions, contracts that were never quite called what they were, but that carried the intent of the deep. Admirals and industrialists walked the docks as if charting a new route, and the language of construction, displacement, tonnage, launch dates, became a public conversation. To those who remembered the silence of Scapa flow, the shift was both a relief and a warning, a gentle yet insistent knocking at the door of what had once been vowed against. The world nodded, sometimes with unease, as the harbour returned to life. Wikipedia +1. And so the first official permissions arrived like a tide lifting small boats. At the head of that returning navy stood figures who carried both the weight of tradition and the hunger for renewal. Men like Eric Rader, who had long served in a changing navy, stepped into roles that blended ceremony with quite real command over the shipbuilding that followed. His presence at the helm gave the reborn fleet a steady, practiced voice that reassured many, even as it unsettled others who remembered the old ambitions of empire. New uniforms, new ranks, and new ships created the outward rhythm of a navy preparing for more than coast defense. In the shipyard workshops, older craftsmen taught younger hands the old ways of brass and steel, while also learning new techniques for engines and hull design. The result was a strange companionship between past and present, men who had seen the war, and men who had only read of it, working side by side toward a purpose that felt inevitable. In that mixing of generations there was both the comfort of continuity and the chill of something conjoined to darker political aims. And beneath the steady footsteps of command, designs moved from paper into metal. The U-boat arm found champions among these men, officers who had never stopped speaking of undersea craft as instruments of strategy, rather than simply tools of war. Carl Dönitz, a quiet man with a precise mind for submarine tactics, began to rise in influence as the Navy found its new shape and focus. He believed that the submarine, more than surface fleets, held the key to sea control through stealth, endurance, and coordination, and his voice found listeners as shipyards filled with new blueprints. Training programs restarted, flotillas were formed, and men who had once kept their knowledge secret now taught it openly to eager recruits. The old art of underwater navigation, the patience of stalking, and the discipline of shared silence were passed on in classrooms and on training cruises. Shipyards that once produced small coastal craft now turned their attention toward hulls shaped for pressure and speed. The combination of doctrine and industry made for a quiet, growing confidence in the possibilities under the waves. Wikipedia, and as doctrine found its echo in steel, the hush of anticipation deepened. Propaganda and pageantry accompanied the practical work, wrapping rebuilding in language of renewal and destiny that soothed some and set others on edge. Parades moved through port towns, bands playing as banners caught the wind, making ordinary citizens feel part of something larger and safer. Factories posted recruitment notices and signs promising work and dignity, while speeches at harbour launches spoke of industry returning to its rightful place. For many workers, it was a welcome shift from hunger to purpose. For others, the rhetoric felt like a new tide of pressure, pushing toward decisions they had not asked for. Yet the docks themselves remained stubbornly mechanical, timber and torque, sparks and sweat, and it was there, in the honest labor of hands and machines, that the country's ambitions were truly forged. Political aims might dress the work in slogans, but the ships rose on the strength of craft and exacting skill. The harbor's daily rituals continued, the creak of ropes, the hiss of steam, the low conversations framed by gull cries and long horizons. And the horizon held new shapes, slowly growing visible through morning haze. International eyes watched with a mixture of curiosity and concern as Germany's shipbuilding numbers quietly swelled. Diplomats whispered, newspapers printed editorials, and old allies adjusted their strategies. Some foreign officials saw the rearmament as a corrective to a treaty they regarded as overly punitive, while others worried it was the first line of a larger, more troubling map. Naval intelligence catalogues compared tonnage figures, noting submarine production and dock activity, and these dry pages would later read like weather charts of a coming storm. Meanwhile, in the docks, workers paid little heed to diplomatic parlance. They measured progress in launched hulls and completed engines, in the smell of fresh paint and the sound of testing boilers. For them, the return of steady work meant food on the table, and a quieter house at night, and that practical comfort tempered whatever unease might be felt higher up. Yet every hammer blow that fixed a plate to a frame also nudged the fate of nations a little further along its course. And so the world sits watchers took notes, while the harbour kept building, quietly and insistently, Holocaust encyclopedia. Within the naval training yards and academies, a new culture of technical excellence blended with old codes of honor and discipline, shaping men who would one day command beneath the waves. Cadets learned to love charts and silence, to trust instruments and each other, and to read the sea like a long, slow script. The rhythms of watchkeeping, of bunks made and messes shared, carved a pattern that turned civilians into submariners with a calm efficiency. Those who remembered the earlier war taught restraint. Those newly enrolled learned the pleasures of precision. In time, these young men would become the hands that guided the hulls through night and storm, the voices that kept calm in pressure, the eyes that read the horizon in degrees. Their training was as much about quiet endurance as it was about tactics, and that temperament would mark the nature of their service. The Navy thus became not simply a machine of steel, but a living, ordered society in which silence was a kind of grace. And as the cadets learned to listen, the deep taught them its patient rules. By the time the new slips were filled, and the first modern hulls slid into water, the transformation felt almost complete. A city and a nation that had rebuilt itself around the sea. Shipwrights, officers, and young recruits stood at the quays and watched the bows part the water with a hush that felt like a benediction and a warning at once. The reborn Navy bore the marks of careful planning and quiet ambition, better engines, sleeker lines, and the Doctrine that would use them with a will. Outside the harbors, the world continued to move, trade, treaties, and distant negotiations. Yet for those who had labored in the long years of secrecy and hope, a new chapter had begun. The harbor exhaled, gulls wheeled overhead, and the sea accepted the new iron with a soft, indifferent caress. But in that indifferent water, the work of men and the designs of leaders now met and would soon test one another in ways none could fully predict. And as the hulls drifted into deeper water, the story turned toward the rise of a force that would command the oceans. The birth of the WW2. The ocean, vast and unending, had always called to certain men in ways that words could not quite capture. Among them was Dönitz, precise, deliberate, and inwardly drawn to the logic of the sea. He had served before, had endured capture, and had studied the quiet mathematics of warfare beneath the waves. In the years when Germany rebuilt its strength, he returned to that same calling with renewed purpose. To others the ocean was distance and mystery. To him it was order, a field of movement governed by silence and patience. He believed the sea could be mastered, not by power, but by rhythm and discipline. Every sound, every current, every shadow of a ship had meaning, if one only learned how to read it. To Dönitz, submarines were not mere vessels. They were instruments in a symphony. Only the ocean could conduct. The sea demanded obedience, and those who followed its laws might just bend history to their will. And in the quiet docks of Kiel, that obedience was about to take form. Dönitz was not a man of flamboyant command. His presence was measured, his tone steady, his thoughts tightly ordered, like the maps on his desk. Those who served under him found him distant at first, yet oddly comforting, a leader who rarely raised his voice, but whose expectations seemed to fill every room. He believed that warfare beneath the sea was a contest of endurance, not aggression. To outlast was to conquer. To vanish was to survive. He taught his men that the greatest weapon was not the torpedo, but the mind behind it. The ocean, he said, would always favor those who listened to its silences. That idea, that a commander could turn absence into power, would come to define the very soul of the U-Boot-Waffe. And so, what began as discipline would soon become doctrine. In the early 1930s, as Germany quietly expanded its naval capabilities, Dönitz began forming the foundation of his submarine force. The first training schools appeared under neutral titles, their purpose cloaked in bureaucratic modesty. Young recruits arrived from across the country, drawn by a mixture of curiosity, patriotism, and the allure of the sea. Many had never seen the ocean before, yet in those first weeks they learned to live by its moods, its calm, its silence, its infinite patience. They studied the mechanics of pressure, the mathematics of navigation, and the delicate balance between stealth and survival. Dönitz oversaw these beginnings with the care of a craftsman. He knew that a crew must become a single organism, each man's heartbeat attuned to the others. When the first submarines began to slide from the slips, they were not simply ships of war. They were the first breath of a doctrine born in stillness. And the deep, as if sensing their arrival, seemed to hold its breath too. The design of the new U-boats combined lessons of the past with dreams of the future. They were smaller at first, coastal vessels intended for training and short patrols. Their steel frames gleamed in the pale northern light, their interiors bare and functional. But to those who walked their decks, they represented something far greater, a return of purpose and the birth of something quietly formidable. Engineers refined their engines for efficiency and silence, experimenting with new alloys and hydrophone systems. Dönitz insisted on reliability over grandeur, precision over pride. A submarine, he once said, is not a ship, it is a heartbeat beneath the surface. Every gauge, every valve, every creak of pressure was to be understood as language. Those who failed to listen to it would not last long. And so, from rivet to rivet, the language of the deep began to take shape. Dönitz's philosophy soon found its name, Rudeltaktik, or Wolfpack tactics. He imagined his submarines not as lone hunters, but as coordinated predators, communicating through coded signals to surround and overwhelm their prey. Each U-boat, he said, was a single wolf, efficient and silent alone, but unstoppable in numbers. To make this possible, he demanded discipline beyond the individual, crews trained relentlessly, drilling for hours in tight quarters, learning to move without words, to eat and sleep in rhythm with machinery. He watched them closely, not as soldiers but as students of pressure and patience. His methods were methodical, his expectations exact. Many came to see him not as a commander, but as something akin to a teacher, one who turned the brutality of war into something precise, almost mechanical in its perfection. And in the quiet hum of those drills, a pack began to form. The young sailors called him the Lion, though not for his roar, for he rarely raised his voice. His authority came instead from presence, from the certainty that he knew the sea more deeply than anyone else. He would walk the narrow corridors of training submarines, his steps steady, even as the vessel rocked beneath him. He spoke to each man with the same calm intensity, reminding them that the ocean respected only those who respected it first. To him, courage was not loud defiance, but the ability to remain composed when the walls closed in and the lights dimmed. Many of his recruits were barely out of adolescence, yet under his tutelage they aged in discipline faster than in years. He gave them not only tactics, but a way of thinking, quiet, patient, and exact. It was this temperament that made the U-boat arm unlike any other branch of service. And as those men learned his ways, they became something more than sailors. Outside the training yards, Germany's political winds were changing rapidly. The rearmament that had once moved in whispers was now a chorus, and the Navy's growth became a symbol of national pride. Dönitz accepted these changes with measured detachment. He was not a politician, and yet he understood the use of ambition when it aligned with purpose. Funds flowed, factories expanded, and new classes of submarines were commissioned. The U-boot WAF was no longer an idea confined to docks and blueprints. It was now a fleet in the making. For Dönitz, the challenge was no longer survival, but refinement. How could perfection be achieved in a world that celebrated haste? He answered not with words, but with precision, ensuring that every launch carried not noise, but control. And under his watchful eye, the first true wolves were loosed upon the sea. By the mid-1930s, the transformation was complete. What had begun as quiet defiance beneath the shadow of treaties had become a fully realized force. The U-boot WAF, disciplined and patient, shaped by the mind of one man, Dönitz stood at its helm not as a conqueror, but as a strategist who saw in the ocean both beauty and inevitability. He often said that the sea was fair, cruel only to those who disrespected it, merciful to those who understood its balance. His men listened and believed. When they sailed for the first time into open water, they did so with a sense of ceremony rather than triumph. The waves closed around them like a seal, and the noise of the world above faded into soft pressure and rhythm. Beneath them stretched the silent chessboard that Dönitz had imagined for years, vast, waiting, full of possibility. And from that stillness, the doctrine of the wolf would rise. The Wolfpack Doctrine. When Dönitz first spoke of Rudeltaktik, the Wolfpack method. Many of his contemporaries regarded it as an eccentric idea, elegant in theory, but impossible in practice. The ocean was too vast, they said, and submarines too isolated to coordinate such precision beneath the waves. Yet Dönitz saw patterns where others saw emptiness. He believed that communication, not size, would define victory. If submarines could act as one, if scattered hunters could form a single, silent pack, then even the mightiest convoy would falter under the weight of cohesion. He called it the unity of the hunt. His submarines would not attack alone, but together, converging like migrating shadows across the moonlit sea. Each boat would find, report, and hold its prey until the others arrived. The ocean, once an expanse of isolation, could become a web of listening and response. And so, a doctrine was born, not in noise, but in understanding. At its heart, the doctrine relied on something deceptively simple: patience. A U-boat captain was not to strike the first target he saw. Instead, he would follow at distance, silent and invisible, reporting the convoy's position by coded signal to headquarters on land. There, in a dimly lit operations room, Dönitz and his staff plotted the convoy's path across a vast, charted ocean. Orders went out to other submarines within range, summoning them to converge like ripples toward a single point. Hours, even days, might pass before the formation was complete. Only then, when the circle was ready, would the attack begin. It was not chaos, but choreography. To Dönitz, it was as if the ocean itself were a chessboard, and every submarine a disciplined piece moving in quiet harmony. And in that harmony, power found its rhythm. Technology, though primitive by modern standards, became the nervous system of this new art. Messages were sent in bursts, short transmissions encoded through the Enigma machine, their meaning hidden beneath layers of numbers and letters. The U-boats listened and waited, decoding orders through flickering lamplight in the narrow confines of steel corridors. Radio waves whispered across the Atlantic, carrying words that could decide the fate of hundreds. The men who sent them did so with care, knowing that each message risked exposure. To communicate was to reveal one's position. To remain silent was to vanish. It was a dangerous balance, and yet it worked, because Dönitz trusted the discipline he had instilled in his captains. They obeyed without hesitation, guided by faith in the unseen web that bound them together. And through that invisible web, the wolves began to gather. When the first coordinated attacks took place, they were unlike anything the seas had witnessed before. Convoys that had once crossed the Atlantic under the illusion of safety now found themselves surrounded, not by a single enemy, but by many, unseen, methodical, and patient. The attacks often came at night, when the horizon was nothing but black water and wind. The U-boats surfaced under cover of darkness, their engines low, their decks wet with spray. To the crews aboard those vessels, the sea seemed to hum with quiet intent. Flares might light the sky for a moment, revealing chaos, but just as quickly, the dark would swallow everything again. To the submariners below, there was no spectacle, only timing, sound, and calculation. Their victory was not in fury, but in silence. And the Atlantic began to whisper their name, the Grey Wolves. In the long hours between contact and command, Dönitz's captains learned to think as one. They trusted the doctrine not because it promised glory, but because it worked with the nature of the sea itself. Each U-boat was an extension of another, spread across hundreds of miles, yet linked by faith in precision. The Wolfpack did not rely on the strength of a single captain's instincts, but on the sum of many quiet decisions made without hesitation. In this way, Dönitz created not just a military strategy, but a new form of cooperation, one that mirrored the very patterns of nature. Even the youngest crewman could feel it, the pulse of the deep aligning with human intent. For the first time, submarines were not isolated hunters, but a living, breathing network of purpose. And purpose, once found, rarely fades easily from the sea. The Allies were slow to understand what had changed. To them, the losses seemed scattered, random ships vanishing into the night without clear cause. But patterns began to emerge, drawn across maps by trembling hands in naval offices from London to Halifax. The convoys were being tracked, cornered, and destroyed with uncanny coordination. They realized too late that the U-boats were not solitary raiders, but an organized fleet of shadows. Each new convoy became a test of endurance, each voyage a contest between detection and deception. For the German submariners, it was proof that Dönitz's vision had become reality. What had once been theory was now rhythm, measured not in words but in tonnage lost and oceans crossed. And as understanding dawned on their enemies, the wolves only grew bolder. Yet beneath the growing success was an almost spiritual code of silence. Dönitz forbade arrogance, forbade waste. He reminded his captains that the sea punished pride swiftly. Each U-boat's crew lived in close quarters for weeks at a time. A single breath of air, a single heartbeat shared among 50 men. They endured not for medals but for the strange serenity of command beneath the waves. Many wrote in their journals of the peace that came with submersion, the sound of the ocean pressing softly against the hull like distant thunder. They called it the breathing of the deep. Even as war gathered momentum above, below there remained a kind of stillness, a suspended world untouched by light. And in that stillness, the wolves found both purpose and peace. By 1941, the Wolfpack doctrine had reached its perfection. The Atlantic was now a battlefield of silence. Invisible lines of movement, signals whispered between machines, and men whose endurance bordered on devotion. Dönitz's fleet had become the embodiment of patience and precision, reshaping the very idea of naval warfare. But as success deepened, so too did the shadow it cast. The ocean had learned their name, and soon so would the world. For every victory in the deep, another challenge was rising, one that no code, no doctrine could easily answer. The hunters would soon discover that even the sea has its limits, and beyond those limits waited the next test, the Scapa flow miracle. In the chill of October 1939, the northern winds swept over the Orkney Islands, carrying with them the quiet hum of a war still gathering its rhythm. The Royal Navy slept behind the sheltered waters of Scapa Flow, believing its great anchorage to be untouchable. It was a fortress made not of walls, but of distance and trust, the kind that comes from habit. To challenge it seemed unthinkable. Yet, somewhere far to the south, one man studied its defenses with patient curiosity and an almost serene confidence. His name was Günther Prien, commander of U-47, a man whose calm matched the ocean's own. When he spoke, his crew listened not out of fear, but of faith. He believed that risk, when measured with discipline, could rewrite history. That belief would carry him into one of the most daring missions of the war, a mission whispered even among his own men as madness. And yet in madness, sometimes genius waits quietly beneath the surface. Scapa Flow was no ordinary harbour. It had once been the resting place of the German fleet that had scuttled itself in surrender at the end of the Great War. Now it was the pride of Britain, a vast circle of steel and stone, guarded by narrow channels, sandbanks, and anchored ships. The tides there were treacherous, the current strong, and the waters shallow in places where submarines were not meant to pass. Dönitz himself had studied its layout and believed there might be a way through, though no sane commander would attempt it. But Priam, quiet and self-contained, volunteered without hesitation. He spoke little of courage and nothing of fame. To him it was a test of mastery, not of glory. His men trusted his composure, his unflinching logic, even when the impossible was placed before him. The plan was simple only in its outline: slip through the defences under the cover of night, strike once and escape before the sea could claim them. And so, with steady hearts and careful preparation, they began their approach. On the night of October 13th, U-47 entered the Pentland Firth, the narrow gateway to the northern waters. The moon was hidden behind low clouds, and the wind carried a fine mist that blurred the horizon into shades of slate. The crew moved with practiced silence, each man knowing his task by heart. Inside the submarine, the air was thick with oil and anticipation. Priam stood at his post, his eyes steady on the periscope and the faint outline of the islands ahead. Every few minutes he gave a quiet order, his voice level and unhurried, as though this were just another patrol. The engines murmured softly, the steel hull shivering with the strain of the current. Outside, the dark sea rose and fell, indifferent to the men who rode its back. And in that indifference, the ocean allowed them passage, at least for a while. Navigating the Kirk Sound, the narrow entrance to Scapa Flow, was an act of near madness. British blockships had been deliberately sunk there to seal the channel, leaving only narrow gaps through which even the smallest submarine could barely pass. Priam guided U-47 forward by instinct and calculation, trusting the faint glimmers of starlight reflected on the water. The submarine brushed past submerged wrecks, its metal scraping softly against ghostly steel. Inside, no one breathed. Every sound, the groan of the hull, the whine of the rudder, felt enormous in the quiet. Minutes stretched into eternities, and then, with a final surge of current and will, they were through. U-47 had entered the heart of Britain's naval sanctuary. The wolves had found their way into the fold. Once inside, the harbour was a world of shadows and still water. Great ships lay at anchor, dark shapes outlined faintly against the dim light of a northern sky. The men aboard U-47 stared in disbelief at what lay before them, the British home fleet, resting peacefully, unaware of what drifted below. Priam's focus remained absolute. Through his periscope, he studied the shapes, identifying one that loomed larger and closer than the rest. HMS Royal Oak, an old battleship, majestic and motionless. He adjusted his course with quiet precision, every gesture deliberate. The torpedo tubes were readied. He gave the order, not as a shout, but as a whisper. Moments later, the deep thud of release was followed by stillness, the kind of silence that comes before consequence. And then the deep answered, with a sound that would echo through the world above. The explosion that followed was not fury, but resonance, a low, distant rumble that rolled through the water like thunder beneath the earth. Lights flickered across the harbour, confusion spread. For a moment, no one understood what had happened. Priam, calm even then, ordered a second strike. The next torpedoes found their mark, and the stillness was broken forever. U-47 slipped away, turning back through the same narrow channel, vanishing into the blackness from which it had come. Behind them, Scapa Flow burned faintly in the distance. A wound opened in Britain's pride. Inside the submarine, the crew said little. They simply listened to the rhythm of the engines, and the quiet pulse of the sea. And the sea, as always, said nothing, but it remembered. When U-47 surfaced safely in the North Sea, dawn was beginning to touch the horizon with a pale light. The men stood in silence on the deck, watching the faint line of gold spread across the waves. They had done what the world believed impossible. Within hours the news reached Berlin, and within days the name Priam had travelled across Europe. Dönitz called him the Bull of Scapa Flow, a title that would follow him forever. But to his crew he remained simply their captain, calm, composed, and quietly human. They celebrated not with cheers, but with exhausted smiles, the way men do when they know they have walked through something sacred and dangerous. In the heart of that morning light, they felt the strange calm of those who had changed history and survived it. And in their silence, the legend began to breathe. The sinking of HMS Royal Oak sent ripples far beyond the waters of Scapa Flow. It shattered the illusion of safety, forcing the Royal Navy to scatter its ships, to fortify every harbour and every channel. For the German Navy, it was more than victory. It was proof that Dönitz's doctrine of precision and daring could reach even the most guarded places. The Wolfpack had found its voice, and its first howl echoed through the world's oceans. Yet for Priam and his men, the glory was quiet, almost burdensome. They returned to duty, knowing that what they had begun would lead to greater hunts and deeper losses. The sea, after all, gives and takes with equal measure. For now, though, the tide was with them, and from that tide would rise new names: Endress, Kretschmer, and the art of silent killers. After the daring triumph at Scapa Flow, the ocean seemed to hold its breath once more. The early war years gave rise to a new generation of commanders, men shaped not by noise but by precision. Among them were Otto Kretschmer and Engelbert Endras, names that would soon be spoken in whispers by sailors and historians alike. They were not loud men, nor proud in the usual sense. They spoke softly, thought carefully, and moved with the patience of craftsmen shaping something delicate and exact. For them, the submarine was not a weapon of destruction, but a living instrument of control. Every maneuver, every calculation, every turn of the periscope carried intention. They were the artisans of underwater warfare, calm in danger, methodical in victory. When they set out to sea, their crews followed not because of charisma, but because of certainty. And certainty, in the deep, is worth more than courage. Otto Kretschmer, who would come to be known as the Silent Otto, believed that words were often the enemy of focus. His command style was marked by stillness, the kind of stillness that draws others into quiet alignment. He insisted that torpedoes were to be used sparingly, each one a statement rather than a shot. One torpedo, one ship, he often said. His patrols were models of economy and exactness, sinking enormous tonnage with minimal waste. Yet those who served with him remembered not the numbers, but the atmosphere aboard his submarine, calm, almost meditative. There were no shouts, no chaos, even when tension rose like the tide. He taught his men that survival was born from rhythm, from keeping one's heartbeat steady even when the hull trembled under pressure. Under his watch, the U-boat became less a vessel of war and more a breathing, thinking being. And in that breath, the art of silence began to take form. Engelbert Endras, who had once served as Priam's first officer at Scapa Flow, carried within him the same discipline, but with a sharper edge of daring. Where Kretschmer was stillness, Endras was quiet momentum, a constant movement beneath the surface, deliberate yet unstoppable. He had learned from Priam that precision could coexist with audacity, that the ocean rewarded those who dared within reason. His patrols were marked by an almost musical balance of risk and restraint, His logbook spoke not of enemies or victories, but of routes, timings, and the subtle dance of sonar, echoes in the dark. He knew the rhythm of the Atlantic like a man who could hear a pulse through walls. Those who served with him often said he never seemed afraid, even when depth charges rolled overhead. He simply waited, listened, and moved again. And in that movement, he carried forward the spirit of Scapa flow. The success of these men came not from aggression, but from respect for the sea, for their machines, and even for their unseen adversaries. They knew the ocean was a place that punished arrogance and rewarded patience. To hunt within it required not just skill, but humility. Kretschmer would often speak softly to his crew before diving, reminding them that the sea allowed them to pass only if they treated it with care. Endras, too, believed in discipline as devotion, a faith that silence and precision could overcome chaos. When they struck, they did so like whispers in the night, unseen until the aftermath. There was no celebration, only the soft hum of engines and the weight of what had been done. Their victories were recorded not with cheers, but with the scratch of a pen against paper. And the ocean, ever impartial, accepted each as another offering to its depth. Kretschmer's patrols through 1940 became legendary. In less than a year he sank more ships than many captains would in an entire career. Yet, he remained distant from the idea of fame. He did not drink to success, nor boast of it in letters home. Instead, he wrote about the silence of the mid-Atlantic, the way the stars looked when reflected in the water, the hum of the motors when the world above was still asleep. His words carried the tone of a man who understood that mastery was not conquest, but alignment. He viewed his work as an art form shaped by patience and rhythm, and while others saw in him a hero of the Reich, he saw only a sailor doing his duty to perfection. And perfection, as always, is a lonely companion. Endras followed soon after, commanding his own boat, the U-46, with the same quiet control that had marked his time under Prion. His patrols were long and disciplined, marked by careful timing and an almost eerie intuition about enemy movements. He seemed to sense where convoys would appear, as if the ocean itself whispered directions. His men trusted him with their lives, not out of obedience, but out of faith in his calm. When storms rolled in, he would simply listen to the wind, measuring its weight and direction before giving orders that seemed to align with the sea's own intent. His leadership was not loud but magnetic. The men said his eyes held a kind of faraway focus, as though part of him always existed beneath the waves. And under his steady command, the legend of the U-boat aces began to take shape. The stories of Kretschmer and Endras soon reached the surface world. Newspapers printed their successes with triumphant tone, calling them knights of the deep. Yet both men remained untouched by the noise of fame. When they returned from their patrols, there were no parades, only quiet dockworkers, salutes, and brief words with Dönitz. The crews disembarked in silence, exhausted and pale, carrying with them the invisible pressure of the deep. They had lived weeks without sunlight, measured their existence in meters and minutes, and returned to land as strangers to its still air. Their victories, though remarkable, had cost them something unseen, a piece of the self that belonged forever to the sea. The ocean does not lend, it trades, and in that trade, these men found their immortality. By 1941, both Endras and Kretschmer had become the embodiment of the U-boot Waffer's philosophy: control, discipline, and endurance. They had transformed submarine warfare into something that seemed closer to meditation than battle. Each patrol was a lesson in restraint. Each return a quiet acknowledgement of balance. Kept to the outside world, they were heroes of efficiency and nerve. To Dönitz, They were proof that his doctrine had matured into art. Yet even as their reputations grew, so too did the storm that gathered beyond the horizon. For while the wolves ruled the ocean now, the hunters above were beginning to adapt. And in that shifting tide, the balance of the deep would soon change, leading to the men who never surfaced. The ocean that had given the U-boats their triumphs also began to take its due. The same silence that once comforted the crews now carried something colder, a weight that pressed not only on the hulls, but on the minds of those within. The deeper the boats went, the more their world shrank. Air grew heavy, light faded to a dim, perpetual dusk, and time itself began to lose meaning. Men lived in rhythm with machinery, the hum of the engines, the hiss of valves, the slow ticking of depth gauges. Sleep came in brief fragments, meals in hurried silence, and laughter in echoes that never lasted long. Outside, the water pressed endlessly against the steel, reminding them of how thin their sanctuary truly was. Each dive was a bargain. Trust in the machine, trust in the captain, trust that the sea would let them rise again. And sometimes quietly it did not. For the ocean, like all great forces, keeps perfect balance. Superstition grew in those narrow corridors. Men whispered that every U-boat had its own spirit, a living thing made from metal and breath, temperamental and proud. Some crews swore by small rituals, a lucky coin placed beside a valve, a certain song hummed before diving, a touch of paint before surfacing. They believed that the sea listened, that it noticed those who disrespected its quiet. The older sailors told stories of boats that had simply vanished, swallowed without sound or signal. They spoke of strange knocks heard deep below, or voices that traveled through pipes when no one was speaking. It was easier to believe in ghosts than in random chance, for when death can arrive without warning, reason becomes too fragile a comfort. The rituals gave them rhythm, the myths gave them courage, and in that fragile courage, the men endured the weight of the unseen. Claustrophobia was the unspoken companion of every submariner. There was no room for solitude, nowhere to escape another's breath. Metal surrounded them on all sides, groaning softly like a restless animal. The smell of oil, sweat, and damp clothes became part of the air, impossible to escape or forget. Yet, after enough days submerged, it ceased to matter. The human mind adjusted, folding itself into the shape of confinement, finding comfort in routine. The men moved like shadows through the narrow spaces, each step known, each motion practiced. They learned to sleep amid vibration, to eat in half-light, to joke in whispers. The ocean outside was vast, but their world was measured in meters, and within those meters they found an odd kind of peace. It was a peace born not of freedom, but of surrender to the deep. Fear lived in quiet corners, rarely spoken but always felt. It showed itself in the stillness, after a depth charge rolled through the water, in the pause before the next sound arrived. Men would listen with their eyes closed, counting seconds, waiting for the ocean to decide their fate. The hull would flex under pressure, the steel moaning softly like something alive. Sometimes the lights flickered, sometimes silence followed, a silence heavier than sound. When the explosions faded, they would exhale together, relief mingling with exhaustion. And though the danger passed, something lingered behind, a tremor not in the hull, but in the soul. Each time they survived, a small piece of calm was taken from them. And the ocean, patient as ever, waited to collect what remained. The men began to see omens in small things, a bird flying far from shore, a malfunctioning light, a dream of rising water. They said that the sea always gave a warning, but only those who listened would hear it. Some wrote letters they knew might never be sent, hiding them among personal belongings, or in the corners of the ship's log. Others grew quieter with each patrol, their laughter softening into a kind of distant smile. Dönitz's reports spoke only of tonnage sunk and missions completed, but behind every line of data was a list of men who did not return. Whole crews vanished, their boats never found. In headquarters they were marked as vermissed, missing though the sea never loses track of its own. And so the roll of the lost began to grow, one wave at a time. For those who survived, memory became its own haunting. They spoke softly of friends whose voices still seemed to echo through the pipes, of laughter heard in empty compartments. Sleep brought dreams of pressure and sound, the groaning hull, the taste of stale air, the eternal descent. Many said that even on land, they could still feel the motion of the sea beneath their feet. They lived between two worlds, the surface where life continued, and the deep where time no longer mattered. Some returned to their hometowns and found them too still. Others longed for the hum of engines, the rhythm that had defined their days. War had made them part of something vast, and peace made them small again. And in that smallness, the ocean's echo followed them home. In Kiel, Wilhelmshaven, and Lorient, memorials began to take quiet shape. Small plaques, names etched in steel, a few flowers left by families who would never know where their sons had fallen. The Navy did not hold great ceremonies for the dead. There were too many, and the war too consuming. Instead, remembrance lived in the simple rituals of the living. A glass raised at dusk, a moment of silence before a patrol, a glance toward the horizon where sky met sea. The men did not speak of heroism, they spoke of endurance, of acceptance. Theirs was not the glory of conquest, but the quiet dignity of those who had faced the unrelenting deep and made peace with it. And even peace, in their world, came wrapped in salt and shadow. By 1941, the number of missing boats had begun to climb sharply. The Atlantic, once a place of mastery, was turning into a graveyard, marked only by coordinates and silence. Yet, even as losses grew, new recruits arrived, drawn by the same strange mixture of duty and fascination that had always pulled men to the sea. They knew the risks, and still they went. The ocean had claimed many, but its call remained irresistible. For those who stayed ashore, it was impossible to understand. For those who went below, explanation no longer mattered. The sea took whom it wished, and spared whom it pleased, and in the minds of those who returned, the missing were never truly gone. For in the quiet heart of the war, a dream still lingered, the vision of an admiral who believed he could command the deep, the admiral of the deep, Dönitz's dream. By 1941, Karl Dönitz had risen from commander to architect, no longer merely the strategist of the deep, but the admiral whose vision shaped the rhythm of Germany's naval war. In him, the U-boot Waffe found not just a leader, but a prophet of precision. He spoke softly, never in anger, his sentences measured like compass bearings. Around him, subordinates felt both calm and weight, the kind that comes from standing before a man utterly convinced of his mission. His world was built on maps and tides, on the geometry of the Atlantic and the mathematics of loss. Every ship sunk, every ton recorded, was another equation in his silent campaign. He believed that the ocean, vast as it was, could be mastered by discipline and will. To Dönitz, strategy was not about chaos, but about patience. The sea rewarded those who moved like it did, slowly, deliberately, endlessly. And so he shaped a war that moved the rhythm of the tide. Within his headquarters at Kernevel, Near Lorient, Dönitz worked in a quiet world of pencil lines and radio codes. The walls were covered in charts, red pins marking convoys like faint constellations scattered across blue. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was fleeting, a thin, private acknowledgement that his plans were unfolding as the sea had promised. His staff spoke in whispers, aware that every signal sent to a submarine carried not only orders but risk. Dönitz demanded precision in everything, from the tone of a report to the spacing of messages transmitted across the ether. His obsession was not born of vanity, but of faith in the system he had built. He trusted the ocean more than men, and yet he used men to speak its language. Each night, as messages arrived from the depths, he would trace his fingers across the map, connecting one submarine to another. And in those faint lines of light, he saw an empire without borders. Though loyal to his country, Dönitz's allegiance to Hitler was complicated, rooted in duty, not in admiration. He saw in Hitler a man of vision, but also of chaos, and he sought to impose order where ideology had left confusion. He believed the war at sea could be won not through brute force, but through quiet inevitability. Yet as his fleet grew, so did his isolation. The more submarines he commanded, the more he withdrew from the surface world. He was a man increasingly defined by his own design, a strategist whose battlefield existed in sound waves and coded transmissions, not in smoke or fire. His subordinates admired him, even feared him, for his ability to make the vast Atlantic feel like something tangible, graspable. But behind that control was something fragile, a deep, unspoken fear that the ocean could never truly be conquered. And beneath his confidence, the deep was already whispering its warning. The war had made Dönitz both powerful and haunted. Each report of success filled him with quiet pride, but each loss lingered like a weight he could not discard. He read every casualty list himself, tracing his finger over the names of crews that would never return. He never wept. Instead, he wrote small notes in the margins of his logs, reminders, corrections, recalculations. To his officers, he seemed made of steel, but inside, fatigue had begun to shape him. He worked through nights, his eyes rimmed in shadow, refusing to rest until every patrol had been accounted for. Those who saw him late in the war said he had the look of a man who had spent too long listening to the sea. His faith in his men was absolute, his faith in victory increasingly conditional. Yet he continued, as all commanders of the deep must, trusting that discipline would outlast despair. And in that discipline he found the only peace the war would ever offer him. To Dönitz, the sea was a mirror, vast, impersonal, and utterly honest. He often spoke of it as though it were an ally, a partner in strategy, rather than a stage for it. The sea, he once told a subordinate, is both weapon and teacher. It does not forgive mistakes. Those words defined his leadership. He demanded from his captains not just courage, but humility, the understanding that to live beneath the waves was to be constantly at the mercy of something greater. In return, his men gave him devotion of an almost sacred kind. Many of them spoke of him not as a superior, but as a figure of quiet faith, a man who could translate the sea's will into human orders. They followed him because he listened, and they trusted him because he understood. And for a time it seemed as though the ocean itself had chosen him. But power, like the tide, does not remain still. As 1942 unfolded, the war expanded beyond even Dönitz's reach. Allied technology improved, radar grew sharper, and convoys learned to travel under air cover. The invisible hunters of the deep were beginning to be hunted in return. Reports of losses arrived faster than before, and the calm rhythm of his maps began to break. Dönitz responded not with anger, but with redoubled precision. More signals, more coordination, more reliance on the patterns that had once ensured victory. Yet even he could not silence the growing hum of change beneath the surface. The Atlantic was no longer silent. It had become a contest of listening, a duel of frequencies and patience. The sea that had once obeyed now resisted, and in that resistance, the Admiral's dream began to waver. Still, Dönitz remained steadfast. In public addresses, his voice carried calm authority, assuring his people that the war in the Atlantic was under control. In private, he confided only to his staff that the sea was turning against them, that the losses were no longer balanced by victories. His faith had become something heavier now, less belief and more endurance. He spoke less often of triumph and more of necessity. For every new submarine commissioned, another was lost. The rhythm of war had shifted, but Dönitz refused to surrender to it. To him the ocean remained a place of possibility, not defeat. He could not see its warning for what it was. A change in tide, slow but unstoppable. And the tide once turned, never truly returns the same. By 1943, the weight of command had settled completely upon him. His once bright eyes had dulled. His movement slowed, but his conviction remained sharp as ever. He believed still that the U-boat arm could alter the course of the war if given time, if given faith. But time, like the ocean, is impartial. Dönitz's maps grew more crowded with red markers, each one a vanished crew, a broken machine, a silence added to the sea's collection. Yet he continued to plot, to hope, to listen. For he was, above all, a man who could not stop listening. The deep had become both his enemy and his reflection, and though his doctrine had once ruled the waves, the Atlantic was preparing its quiet rebellion. And in that rebellion, the ocean would turn red. The golden year, 1941. The year 1941 dawned cold and iron grey, stretching over the Atlantic like a vast, patient heartbeat. It was a year that seemed made for Dönitz's doctrine, for the quiet discipline of his wolves, who prowled beneath the surface with sharpened instinct. Convoys that had once crossed the ocean with confidence now sailed through a silence filled with unseen movement. The U-boats were everywhere and nowhere, tracing patterns through the currents, with the precision of trained predators. Night after night, they rose to the surface to breathe, their hulls slick with salt, their crews pale with exhaustion and triumph. The air smelled of diesel and the cold breath of the deep, a scent that became the perfume of their victories. In headquarters, messages poured in, tonnage sunk, convoys scattered, the arithmetic of conquest written in radio static. To Dönitz, each report was another step toward mastery, another proof that the ocean obeyed those who listened to its pulse. Yet, even in victory, there was something solemn about the rhythm, as though the sea itself knew it was giving too much, too easily. And in that quiet awareness, the golden year began its slow unfolding, bright with triumph and dark with consequence. And beneath the surface, the wolves swam as if the sea had been made only for them. Each patrol during that year carried the stillness of ritual, a practiced dance between man, machine, and ocean. The crews knew their routines so well that they moved without speech, each motion guided by instinct born from repetition. Inside the hulls, red lights glowed softly against metal walls, and the constant hum of the engines became their lullaby. Sleep came in fragments, and dreams often blurred into reality, of endless horizons and the faint shimmer of phosphorescent waves. Above them merchant ships passed unaware, their decks lit faintly, like drifting lanterns in the dark. Kretschmer, Endras, and their fellow captains moved among them, with the grace of hunters who no longer needed to see their prey to know its path. The attacks were quiet, precise, almost surgical. Torpedoes released in silence, impacts felt more than heard. For the crew's success brought no cheer, only a deep settled calm, as if the ocean itself had approved their work. Their victories were counted in whispers, their emotions folded neatly away with the same discipline that guided their torpedoes, and somewhere between exhaustion and mastery, they began to believe they were truly untouchable. But nothing that belongs to the sea ever remains untouched for long. To the outside world, 1941 was the year of invincibility, the year when the U-boats ruled the Atlantic as kings of the unseen. Newspapers spoke of daring patrols and of captains whose names sounded like legend. In Berlin, the ministry used their success as proof of destiny, printing their faces beside triumphant slogans about control of the seas. Yet for those who lived the war beneath the waves, the reality was quieter, lonelier, and strangely dreamlike. The ocean was vast and indifferent. It offered no applause. The men learned that dominance over the sea was not a feeling, but a tension, a fragile balance held between silence and risk. Every dive was a reminder that victory and destruction shared the same depth. Still, the numbers climbed, and the tonnage charts filled with inked satisfaction. For Dönitz, each line was another breath in his vision of total submarine war, another promise that patience would bring final victory. And for a time, it seemed as though patience might truly conquer the world. At Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, the harbours filled with the ghosts of triumph, returning submarines gliding home under banners of mist and gulls. The crews disembarked pale and weary, their faces hollowed by confinement, their eyes reflecting the strange distance of men who had lived too long without sky. They walked with the rhythm of the sea still in their bodies, their steps careful, as though land might move beneath them. The dockworkers greeted them with quiet admiration, offering cigarettes, bread, and news from home. There were no parades, only nods and murmured respect, for the men of the U-boats belonged to a world apart. Each patrol had taken something invisible from them, a toll measured in sleeplessness and memory, and yet they returned again and again, drawn back to the deep as if by instinct. Dönitz visited them sometimes, shaking hands and offering soft words of pride, his eyes already turned toward the next campaign. For him the war was not a series of battles, but a long conversation with the ocean, one he believed he could still win through will alone. But the sea listens to no man forever, not even one who worships it. The numbers that defined that golden year were staggering. More than 2 million tons of Allied shipping sent to the ocean floor, thousands of men lost to the cold dark below. Yet to the submariners, the scale of their success was abstract, detached from the human world above. They measured their victories in days survived, in engines that still worked, in sunlight glimpsed through a periscope. Their reality was made of small things, a shared cigarette, a letter from home, the sound of laughter echoing softly through metal corridors. In those moments, the war felt far away, as though the deep had swallowed it whole and left only survival. Still they knew their actions shaped the world beyond, that somewhere ships burned and families waited for news that would never come. It was a truth they carried quietly, never discussed, as if speaking it aloud might invite the ocean's judgment. And so the golden year glimmered with light and shadow, success and silence in equal measure. For every light that burns too brightly, the sea keeps a darker reflection below. By midsummer, the rhythm of victory had become a kind of trance. The Wolfpacks worked like living systems, their movements precise, their coordination seamless. Crews no longer needed long explanations. Orders were brief, signals coded, and instinct did the rest. Dönitz's command center became a cathedral of efficiency, its walls alive with maps, pins, and whispered reports. Each convoy destroyed brought the Admiral a fleeting satisfaction that dissolved into more planning, more calculation, more faith in the system. To him it was not greed, but perfection, the refinement of an art form honed by suffering and patience. The sea seemed to agree, yielding ship after ship to his strategy, its surface marked by quiet circles where steel had sunk. But in the stillness after each victory, there was an echo, faint but growing, like the far-off sound of something turning in its sleep. And in that sound, the future was already changing its direction. For those at sea, the signs were subtle but unmistakable. Patrols grew longer, the ocean less forgiving, the enemy more alert. The same convoys that once scattered in panic began to travel in tighter formation, guarded by ships whose sonar could now hear what once moved unheard. Allied air patrols expanded, sweeping vast stretches of water that had once belonged only to the wolves. A new kind of tension settled into the crews, not fear, exactly, but the knowledge that the ocean was no longer theirs alone. Some dismissed it as chance, others quietly began to sense that the tide had turned, yet the orders did not change, and so they obeyed. They dove, they waited, they listened, and they hoped the sea would remain loyal a little longer. But loyalty, even that of the ocean, is not eternal. By the year's end, the U-boat arm stood at its highest peak, unaware that it was also standing at the edge of its decline. The numbers still gleamed with victory, the ports still hummed with confidence, and Dönitz still believed the ocean would never betray him. Yet beneath the waves, the first signs of change stirred. Faint pings of sonar, faster escorts, skies that no longer hid their watchful wings. The golden year had been both a triumph and a warning, and few could yet tell the difference. The wolves had ruled the sea, but their empire was built on silence, and silence, like all things, cannot last forever. Still, the men sailed on, their faith unbroken, their purpose clear, their hearts bound to the deep that had both fed and haunted them. For now the Atlantic belonged to them, and they moved through it like whispers through a dream. But dreams fade, and the ocean remembers, and soon that remembrance would come in kind, when the hunters became the hunted. Inside the narrow hull of a U-boat, life unfolded in a rhythm that belonged only to the deep sea. Space was so limited that men learned to move sideways, their shoulders brushing against pipes warm with condensation. The air was thick, heavy with diesel fumes, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of machinery that never slept. Every surface was slick with oil, every sound close enough to touch. Even in the still hours of night, the submarine was never silent. There was always the hum of motors, the whisper of air through vents, the steady heartbeat of the engines. The men lived by that rhythm, each pulse of sound a reassurance that they were still alive. Sleep came in shifts, barely a few hours at a time, bodies twisting into corners or hammocks that swayed with the movement of the sea. There was no privacy, no solitude, only shared endurance. It was a world built on patience and proximity, where even silence had texture. And in that texture, life continued beneath the surface of the world. The smell of the submarine was unlike anything on land, a living scent of confinement. Diesel mixed with metal, damp clothes, unwashed skin, and the faint sweetness of canned rations. In the beginning, the new recruits tried to ignore it, breathing through sleeves or cloth, but soon the odor became invisible, as much a part of existence as the sound of the engines. The air itself seemed to grow older with each passing day, thinning and thickening in cycles as carbon dioxide built and was scrubbed away. The men grew accustomed to the weight of it on their lungs, the way every breath carried the memory of the last. Sometimes, when the boat surfaced and fresh air poured down through the open hatch, they would laugh without words, like children, faces turned upward toward the cold wind. For those few moments, the sky became a forgotten gift, and then just as quickly, the hatch would close again, sealing them once more inside their floating world of shadows. The sea always allowed them a taste of freedom, only to take it back again. Meals were simple, taken where one could find space to sit, eaten quickly and often in silence. Fresh bread was a treasure during the first few days of a patrol, soft and fragrant amid the mechanical odors. But soon it turned to hard biscuits and preserved meats. Coffee was rationed carefully, passed hand to hand like a shared secret of warmth. There were jokes, of course, quiet humor born of fatigue, the kind that held despair at bay. Someone might hum an old song while twisting a wrench, or tell stories of home that blurred into half-truths and memory. In that narrow tube beneath the sea, laughter was more than comfort. It was defiance. They laughed at the ocean that pressed against them, at fate, at the absurdity of existing where men were never meant to go. And in those small bursts of laughter, humanity endured. For even in the iron coffin, the heart found ways to keep beating. Music, when it came, drifted softly through the corridors. A gramophone or a harmonica played between shifts. The notes echoed gently, caught by the curved walls, turning the submarine into a chamber of sound. Some men closed their eyes, imagining the distant hills of home or the laughter of loved ones waiting beyond the horizon. The melodies were slow and nostalgic, filled with longing rather than joy. In those moments, time seemed to pause, the war beyond forgotten. Yet, when the music faded, the silence returned heavier, more absolute. The men rarely spoke of what they missed, for to name it was to make the distance too real, so they played instead, quietly, like prayers in a language the sea might understand. And the ocean, in its vast indifference, listened without reply. Fear was a constant companion, though rarely shown. It lived in the pauses between orders, in the quiet before diving, in the sudden silence when sonar pings echoed faintly through the hull. Each man learned to master his breathing, to slow his pulse until it matched the rhythm of the deep. When depth charges exploded far above, the submarine trembled, lights flickered, and the air grew tense and still. In those moments, no one spoke. They waited, eyes closed, feeling the vibrations like distant thunder under the skin. Afterwards, when the sounds faded, someone might make a small joke, not because it was funny, but because laughter was a bridge back to life. Fear never left them, but it learned to coexist with endurance. And endurance, like the sea, became their truest companion. Days blurred into one another, marked not by sun or stars but by duty and repetition. The sea outside was invisible, felt only through pressure and sound. The men learned to measure time by the rhythm of the engines or the changing taste of the air. Watches rotated endlessly, 6 hours on, 6 off, a cycle that eroded any sense of day or night. Letters from home were read until they frayed, each word a fragile connection to a distant, slower world. There were birthdays, anniversaries, even holidays, all observed with the same quiet dignity. A shared cigarette, a murmured toast, a nod toward memory. To the men of the U-boats, home became not a place, but an idea, something they carried inside the narrow space of their hearts. The world above moved on without them, but below, time was circular, eternal, and unchanging. And so they drifted between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Camaraderie was their salvation. In the confined space, friendships formed quickly and deeply, forged through shared danger and silence. A look, a gesture, a single word could convey everything: reassurance, warning, understanding. They knew each other's habits, the way one man tapped his finger before giving an order, the way another prayed silently before every dive. These small details became anchors of sanity, proof that they still lived in a human world, even here in the iron belly of the sea. There was comfort in routine, in familiar faces, in the trust that no one stood alone. When one man faltered, another quietly took his place. In that small universe of steel and salt, unity was not a concept, it was survival. And through that unity, they found strength enough to face the endless water around them. When a patrol ended, the return to land felt both joyous and strange. The first breath of open air burned the lungs, and the sky seemed impossibly wide. They walked awkwardly, unsteady after weeks of confinement, blinking in sunlight that felt too bright to be real. Laughter returned briefly, but so too did silence, for not all patrols ended this way. Some boats never came home. Their names were whispered in the docks. Their absence felt like a tide that never receded. The men of the surviving crews knew this, and so each return carried both relief and guilt. They toasted the living and remembered the lost in quiet rituals, unspoken yet deeply understood. Above them, the war continued, but below, the deep waited patiently for their next descent. And as the sun dipped over the Atlantic, the silence returned once more, the still, heavy calm before the hunters became the hunted. By 1943, the Atlantic no longer sang the same song. Its long, dark corridors that had once sheltered the U-boats began to hum with a new and foreign sound, the echo of sonar, the listening heartbeat of the enemy. What had been their sanctuary turned subtly against them. Each movement now mirrored, each whisper traced by waves that no longer obeyed their silence. The ocean itself seemed to tighten, shrinking around them like a patient trap. Dönitz's wolves, who once glided unseen through vast, forgiving waters, found themselves surrounded by machines that could hear the pulse of their propellers and smell the trail of their exhaust. The Allies had learned to listen. They had learned to see in the dark. Radar swept the skies, sonar searched the depths, and the sea that had once hidden the hunters now carried their secrets to their pursuers. The balance had shifted, quietly, completely, and the wolves began to understand what it felt like to be followed. At first the change was subtle. A few more ships lost here, a patrol that failed to return there. Dönitz dismissed it as chance, as the sea's natural toll on those who dared to dwell within it. But as the months unfolded, silence grew heavier across the radio lines. Messages that once came regularly, brief, coded reports of success, began to vanish into the ether, unanswered. Commanders waited for call signs that never spoke again. The Atlantic, once full of chatter and movement, grew quiet, as if the deep itself was swallowing the voices of its children. In London and Washington, new technologies were being perfected: high-frequency direction finding, long-range patrol aircraft, improved depth charges that sank deeper and struck harder. The Allies had learned the rhythm of the U-boats and were now composing their own counterpoint. And in that new music, the hunters began to lose the melody they once owned. For the men inside the submarines, the change was felt long before the statistics confirmed it. They began to notice how quickly enemy escorts appeared, how relentless the pursuit had become. The silence that once protected them was now a mirror, reflecting their every breath. Every dive carried tension like a held note, stretched and trembling. The old rituals, the superstitions, the small jokes began to fade. Even laughter grew quieter, as though the sea itself had forbidden levity. Above them, aircraft prowled day and night, dropping sonar buoys that whispered through the waves like tiny, listening ghosts. There was no longer anywhere to hide. Each dive became both refuge and prison, each ascent a gamble against a sky filled with unseen eyes. And the deep, once their ally, now watched with indifferent patience. The depth charge became the new language of terror. It did not shout, it whispered in vibration and waiting. The men would hear the distant plop as the canisters entered the water, followed by a stillness so complete that even breathing felt intrusive. Then the ocean would convulse, the hull trembling like a struck bell, the lights flickering in silent protest. Each explosion was a conversation between steel and pressure, between fear and endurance. They learned to count between the blasts, to predict the rhythm of death, to hope the next would fall just far enough away. And when the attack ended, they would lie in silence, waiting for their own heartbeat to quiet again. The air grew stale, the heat unbearable, but no one dared to speak. They existed only as thought, suspended in waiting. And when the ocean stilled again, it was never clear whether it was mercy or postponement. The U-boat bases along the French coast became quieter too. Gone were the days of confident returns, of tired smiles and the quiet satisfaction of survival. The docks were filled with absences, missing crews, missing captains, boats that had simply not come home. Those who remained carried a haunted calm, the kind that comes when men realize that numbers no longer favor them. Dönitz continued to send them out, driven by faith in discipline, in strategy, in the idea that patience could still outwit technology. But even he knew that the tide had turned. The men leaving port now did so with the quiet dignity of those who understand their odds. Yet go anyway. It was no longer about conquest. It was about endurance, about holding on to the fragments of mastery that the sea had not yet taken. And the sea, ever watchful, waited to take the rest. The ocean's moods became unpredictable. Storms rolled over the Atlantic with sudden fury, and the once calm depths seemed to conspire with the enemy above. Sonar pings echoed through the water like ghostly pulses, surrounding the submarines with invisible circles of pursuit. When they surfaced at night to breathe, they did so quickly, scanning the horizon for the flicker of aircraft lights. Some nights, the stars reflected on the water like distant fires, and for a moment, the men could almost forget the danger. But those moments grew shorter with every patrol. The nights became shorter too, as new Allied radar pierced the darkness that had once been their shield. The U-boats were hunted by both light and sound, trapped between the heavens and the abyss. And in that narrow space, courage became something quieter, more fragile. Even as defeat crept closer, the discipline of the U-boat arm did not falter. Orders were followed, torpedoes launched, tactics refined. There was no panic, only an increasing stillness. The acceptance of those who have learned to live with uncertainty. Captains sent their final reports in calm tones, describing impossible odds with the precision of accountants. The war had become a meditation on inevitability. Dönitz, still in his bunker, read those reports by dim lamplight, tracing each loss as if it were a wave on an ever-receding shore. He believed, perhaps because he had to, that the tide would one day turn back in his favor. But the tide does not listen to belief. It listens only to gravity and time, and both had already shifted beyond his reach. By the year's end, the hunters of the deep had become ghosts of their former selves. The Atlantic was no longer their domain, but their graveyard, vast, silent, unmarked. Out of every 5 men who served aboard the U-boats, 4 would never return. Those who did bore the look of men who had spoken too long with the sea and learned its final truth. For the ocean had always been patient, and in the end, it reclaimed everything it was owed. The golden age of the Wolfpacks was over, and the silence they once commanded now belonged to their memory. Yet even in defeat, there remained a strange beauty in their endurance, a quiet dignity in their persistence against an impossible tide. The hunters had been hunted, and the circle had closed. And in the red Atlantic twilight of war, the waters began to turn, leading to the next storm, when the Atlantic itself would bleed. In the spring of 1943, the ocean changed its face as if a long sleep had ended and a storm had finally woken. The wolf packs that once moved with slow, confident grace now found themselves pierced by light and sound from above and below. Escorts travelled with sharper purpose, aircraft cut the night like blades, and small, patient machines listened for the faintest echo of a propeller. Convoys no longer drifted as easy prey, but moved in guarded columns with ships that hunted as well as guarded. The confidence that had warmed the crews in 1941 and 1942 cooled into a steadier, colder fear. Reports came in numbers that smothered the maps, boats missing, captains unaccounted for, patrols that didn't answer the radio. Men on shore read them with the same quiet disbelief as the sailors who had survived. The rhythm of loss became steady, a metronome of bad news that even Dönitz could not ignore. And in that steady beat, something like panic began to creep into planning and to sit heavy at the desks of command. The sea that had once given so freely now returned a different reckoning. Crews felt the shift long before the figures on paper made it official. A patrol that once meant routine now carried the hush of finality. The jokes grew infrequent. The cigarettes were smoked more slowly, and lookouts stared farther as if the horizon itself had become unkind. Where men once spoke of tactics and pride, they now traded small comforts and last letters. Commands that had been simple directives became pleas for caution. Even the youngest sailors, who had never known the early triumphs, sensed the pattern of attrition like a change in tide. Depth charges arrived with new accuracy, and a cold deliberation that left no room for optimism. Air cover reached farther and stayed longer, blotting the sky that had once been free. The ocean that had once listened now replied with a relentless chorus. And in that chorus, the illusion of invulnerability quietly unraveled. At headquarters, the mood shifted from quiet confidence to restless calculation. Maps were filled with pins of loss instead of lines of success, and men who had once smiled at charts now stared at them with thin lips. Dönitz and his staff worked longer hours, tracing convoy routes, as if reading a landscape of traps. New reports of broken codes and intercepted messages arrived like small cold notes of warning. The Admiral paced the limits of strategy, seeking any seam in the weave of Allied defences that might be pried open again. Submarine orders grew more conservative, and then more desperate as command tried to balance risk and necessity. Replacements were sent faster, training accelerated, and doctrine tweaked in hopes of regaining rhythm. But for every adjustment, the ocean seemed to have learned another lesson, and slowly the idea that the U-boat arm could still dictate the pace of war began to feel like a tender, fading memory. The maps, once bright with possibility, began to close over like a sky at dusk. The Allies, patient and inventive, stitched together technologies and tactics that tightened the noose. Long-range aircraft extended the eyes of escort groups into emptier waters, shrinking the places where U-boats could truly hide. Escort carriers placed air power closer to convoys, their small flight decks, a new kind of guardian that turned black nights grey. Radar learned to see not just metal, but movement in the dark. HF/DF picked up tiny whispers of radio that betrayed position. Sonar grew more musical and merciless in its search. Intelligence wove signals and sightings into a fabric of prediction and response. Men in far-off rooms connected dots that meant the difference between silence and exposure. For the submariners, these inventions were not just machines but an invisible pressure closing in from all directions. The ocean, once a veil, had become a net, and as the net tightened, the wolves found their paths constricted and dangerous. The losses of May 1943 drew a particular kind of shadow across the fleet. Historians later named it Black May, but for those in the moment, it was a month of thin faces and quiet funerals. Whole flotillas that had returned with pride a year earlier now failed to come back at all. The docks filled with men who had watched friends leave and never return. Officers wrote terse logs and tried to pass luck from fate. The Admiralty felt the strain as fathers and mothers sent questions that could not be answered. The men left behind began to ask whether persistence was sacrifice or futility. Yet even amid loss there was no grand surrender. Orders were still given, and boats still pushed out to sea. Duty, in its stern way, demanded continuity, even as the sea took more and more, and so the fleet pushed on, riding a tide that had turned against it. Inside boats underway, the atmosphere hardened into a different kind of focus. Captains tightened procedures, reduced radio traffic, and made decisions with an economy that bordered on austerity. Watch rotations were enforced more strictly. Every mistake had sharper consequences. Crews became shadows of their former boisterous selves. Eyes burned bright with wakeful strain. Small comforts, a hot meal, a letter from home, were treasured like relics. Training that once felt endless now proved indispensable, and the margin for error thinned to the size of a breath. Yet even with increased discipline, the sea found ways to expose vulnerability. New escort tactics forced submarines into deeper, longer dives, where machines strained and air thinned. Men learned to live with a low hum of dread, a companion they spoke of in rare private moments. And in that private company, the human cost of strategy took up residence. The command chain creaked under moral and logistical pressure, and dissent rustled like a distant wind among some officers. Questions that had been unspoken in earlier years began to surface in letters and confidential reports. Was Doctrine to blame, logistics, or the sheer accumulation of Allied advantage? Some argued for new types of boats, others for different theatres, and still others for more aggressive technology. Debate, however quiet, is a form of movement, and movement unsettled. The certainty upon which Dönitz had staked so much. Yet the Admiral held firm to his belief that coordination and endurance could still turn the tide. He believed not in sudden triumph, but in the slow calculus of war, and he continued to order the sea to yield. The men who received those orders carried them like heavy objects, feeling their edges, and as plans shifted and arguments cooled, the ocean continued its indifferent accounting. By autumn, the shape of the campaign had altered fundamentally. Losses were no longer tolerable, and the U-boat arm could not replenish itself at the rate required. The ports that had once echoed with the return of boats grew quieter, and the crews that came back carried something that looked like resignation. New technologies and tactics had blurred the sanctuary beneath the waves into forever danger, and the human cost had become a ledger that no strategy could comfortably balance. The golden memory of 1941 seemed distant, more like a dream half remembered at dawn. Still men sailed on, out of duty, compulsion, or the stubbornness that binds service to action. The Atlantic had turned red, not simply with numbers but with the weight of absence and grief. And as winter neared, the U-boat arm faced the long work of survival under a sky that no longer favored them. What had been mastery had become endurance, and endurance itself is a fragile thing. The fall of the Wolfpacks followed soon after. By the winter of 1943, the great tide that had once carried Dönitz's fleet toward glory had begun to ebb beyond recall. The Wolfpacks, once symbols of fear and precision, now scattered in confusion across an ocean that no longer offered them hiding places. The Allies had learned their rhythms, their codes, and their silences. Machines that could once whisper to one another beneath the waves now betrayed themselves through the very messages that bound them together. The enigma, once thought unbreakable, had become porous, its secrets unraveled by minds working in quiet rooms far from the sea. Every coded signal now carried with it a small echo of exposure. Convoys that had once fled now fought back with brutal efficiency. For the submariners, every dive felt longer, every ascent riskier, every order heavier with doubt. The Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground. It had become a vast graveyard of vanished ambition. And in that graveyard, the ocean reclaimed what it had lent so briefly to man. At sea, the sound of sonar pings had replaced the stillness that once protected them. Each pulse struck like a heartbeat, drawing closer, brighter, unavoidable. The men no longer feared silence. They feared the sound of being found. Depth charges reigned with rhythmic certainty, marking the slow dismantling of an empire that had lived beneath the waves. Inside the submarines there was no panic, only fatigue. The kind of weary surrender that comes when hope and duty no longer fit neatly together. Commanders still gave orders, still spoke with measured calm, but the words now felt smaller, less certain. They maneuvered through waters they no longer trusted, guided by instincts that no longer applied. The ocean had changed its laws, and no one had told them. What had once been mastery had become survival, reduced to minutes, meters, and breath. And even survival was beginning to feel borrowed. Dönitz, still commanding from his bunker, stared at his maps with the patience of a man refusing to wake from a dream. Each red pin marking a lost boat was another thread cut from the web he had spent years weaving. He had once spoken of control, of the sea as a chessboard on which every move could be measured and predicted. Now the board itself had dissolved beneath his hands. Reports arrived slower, their messages clipped and incomplete, the voices behind them fading mid-transmission. Sometimes he listened to the static, long after the signal ended, as if waiting for the ocean to answer back. His faith in the fleet remained outwardly unshaken, but within him the quiet certainty had begun to erode. He told his subordinates to endure, to adapt, to believe. Yet even belief has tides, and his was beginning to recede. And as it withdrew, it left behind the wreckage of what once seemed eternal. The crews who still sailed did so with eyes that no longer sought victory, only return. They had grown used to the endless motion of loss, to the sound of the ocean's indifference pressing against the steel around them. Letters from home carried a weight they could not name, written by hands that no longer understood the cost of the sea. Many of the young men were barely 20, yet their faces bore the stillness of age. Between patrols they walked the docks in silence, smoking cigarettes they barely tasted, watching gulls drift over the harbour like ghosts. Their boats, battered, patched and weary, became symbols of endurance rather than pride. Even the sea seemed tired of them. Still they went back, drawn by duty and by something more difficult to name, a longing for the only world that made sense, even as it destroyed them. For those who live by the sea, leaving it is harder than dying in it. In the skies above, Allied aircraft watched with unblinking eyes. The Atlantic had become smaller through invention, its secrets charted, its silence broken. Radar, once a word whispered in curiosity, now defined the boundaries of every patrol. The sea could no longer conceal. Even its shadows betrayed the shape of what lay beneath. Submarines that surfaced to breathe were struck before they could exhale. Those that remained below slowly suffocated on their own patience. The balance of war had shifted from courage to calculation, and courage alone was no longer enough. The ocean's vastness, once the U-boat's greatest ally, had turned into a stage too wide to cross unseen, and in that openness, defeat arrived not with fury, but with certainty. The wolves had outlived the forest that once hid them. Dönitz began to change his orders, pulling back the fleets that had once roamed freely across the Atlantic. He called for regrouping, for new boats, for new designs, faster, quieter, capable of breathing beneath the surface longer than before. But technology, like the tide, moves on its own time, and the ocean does not wait for man to catch up. The newer models came too late, ghosts of potential arriving in a world that had already shifted beyond them. The men who received them were already veterans of loss, trained in endurance, but unaccustomed to hope. Dönitz continued to write, to plan, to speak of victory deferred. Yet his voice, once calm and commanding, now carried the faint tone of someone speaking against the wind. The sea did not listen. It had already chosen its silence. And in that silence, his dream of mastery began to dissolve completely. By the end of 1944, the U-boat arm was a shadow of what it had been. The harbours that once bustled with steel and song were now quiet, their waters rippling with memory rather than movement. The submarines that left did so under skies thick with watchful eyes, their departures more like farewells than missions. Those who remained behind knew the outcome but spoke of it only in half sentences. To admit defeat was forbidden. To ignore it was impossible. The sailors wore their uniforms with pride still, but it was a pride tempered by fatigue, by the knowledge that the deep no longer belonged to them. The ocean had closed its doors one after another until only narrow corridors of survival remained. And through those corridors the last of the Wolfpacks slipped into history. The tide had gone out, and with it the echoes of 1,000 engines fading into the dark. When the end came, it did not roar, it exhaled. The sea absorbed the last patrols quietly, leaving behind no witnesses but the waves themselves. In the north and in the mid-Atlantic, the remains of steel and bone settled into the sand like forgotten prayers. The men who had once ruled the depths now rested within them, their voices forever mingled with the murmur of the currents. Dönitz, still believing in order amid ruin, carried on with the stoic calm of a man who had learned to love what had destroyed him. The Wolfpacks were gone, their names written now only in ledgers and on stone, yet their story lingered in the hush between tides, a testament to what men will endure for mastery over something they can never truly possess. And beyond that, hush lay a quieter world, where only the last patrols remained, the last patrols of 1944. By 1944, the war beneath the waves had become a quiet kind of suicide. The harbours of France and Norway, once alive with the hum of engines and the laughter of sailors, now echoed with the sound of departures made without illusion. Each submarine that slipped from its berth carried men who understood the mathematics of their fate, that the Atlantic had become a hunter's field where the hunted rarely survived. Yet they went still, not out of faith in victory, but from something older and harder to name. Duty had long since transformed into ritual, and ritual has a rhythm that even despair cannot interrupt. They saluted the flags, checked their instruments, exchanged quiet words with mechanics who knew they would never see them again. The sea awaited as it always had, calm on the surface, merciless beneath. There were no speeches now, no promises, only silence wrapped around purpose. Each voyage was a farewell written in steel. And still, the ocean received them with its indifferent grace. For the men aboard, the knowledge of their likely death did not bring fear so much as stillness. They moved through the submarine with a gentleness born of acceptance, speaking softly, conserving both breath and words. Each man had found his own way of making peace with the inevitable, one through prayer, another through jokes that grew quieter as the miles slipped by. Letters were written but rarely sent, tucked into pockets or folded beneath mattresses, small confessions meant for the surface that would never see daylight. Food was rationed, fuel counted to the drop, and the mission objectives were spoken of in terms that no longer promised success, only endurance. The sound of the engines became the only heartbeat they trusted. When they dived, the world above ceased to exist, and time itself became fluid, meaningless. They no longer fought for Germany, or for victory. They fought to remain human in a place that demanded surrender. And in that quiet surrender, they found a strange kind of courage. The orders had changed in tone. Dönitz no longer spoke of triumph or total war. His words had softened into phrases of necessity and resolve. He knew, as his men did, that each patrol now tested not strategy but faith. Communications were brief, measured, as if economy of speech could somehow save lives. The code still worked, the signals still pulsed, but behind every message was a hollow truth. The ocean was listening, and it no longer took sides. Some commanders disobeyed and turned back early. Others went farther than commanded, unwilling to return empty-handed. The distinction between defiance and devotion blurred beneath the surface. The war above raged toward its crescendo, but below the rhythm slowed, like a song nearing its final note. And in that slow rhythm, the U-boats continued their descent into legend and silence alike. By late autumn, the Atlantic had become a place of ghosts. The men aboard spoke less and listened more, attuned to the small creaks and groans of their vessel, like monks to the chants of a sacred ritual. Each sound carried meaning: the sigh of the hull, the hiss of the valves, the long silence between pings of sonar. The sea no longer frightened them. It had become an old companion, one whose moods they had learned to accept without question. Above them, the air was filled with the hum of patrol planes, their searchlights cutting faintly through the mist, but few dared to surface now. The air they breathed was stale but familiar, the dim lights inside the submarine their only sunrise. Men began to dream awake, their thoughts drifting between the memory of land and the endless pressure of the deep. The ocean's weight pressed against the walls, and their minds alike, but both held, and holding became its own quiet act of defiance. Every departure was marked by ceremony, though not of celebration. The men gathered in small groups on the dock before boarding, the cold wind cutting across the water, the horizon painted with the pale light of dawn. Their families, when allowed, stood far back, too familiar with the unspoken truth to wave. The smell of oil and salt mingled with the scent of coffee that no one drank. They shook hands with the mechanics, nodded to the officers, and climbed aboard with a steadiness that belied their knowledge. As the boat slid from the harbour, the shore receded into silence, the figures on land shrinking into shadow. No one said goodbye anymore. There was no need. Each man carried the farewell inside him, heavy as the sea itself. And once the harbour faded, the world above ceased to matter. For those who survived even one patrol in 1944, memory became both a blessing and a burden. They spoke of the strange beauty of phosphorescence in the night water, of the way stars trembled on the surface like reflections of lost souls. They remembered the stillness after each attack, when nothing moved except the slow roll of the sea. There were moments when the ocean seemed almost kind, wrapping them in quiet that felt eternal. But kindness in the deep was never real. It was a pause, not a reprieve. When sonar calls returned, when depth charges fell, when the lights flickered and air grew thick, they remembered that kindness was only another form of silence. Some prayed, some laughed softly, some simply stared at the steel walls as though they could see through them into infinity. And infinity, they learned, was not distance but surrender. On land, the world was already shifting. Cities were falling, the front lines collapsing, and the Reich itself beginning to unravel. The U-boats had become relics of a fading empire, the last instruments of a vision that had already dissolved into dust. Yet, even as everything above them crumbled, the men below kept to their routines. Diving, surfacing, listening, enduring. It was not obedience anymore. It was identity. They had become creatures of the deep, bound not to ideology, but to rhythm, to machinery, to the familiar hum that separated life from the void. Their discipline remained intact, because it was all that still belonged to them. The war no longer had victory to offer, but it still demanded witnesses, and so they continued, each patrol a final testament to a promise once made and long since forgotten. And the sea, eternal and impartial, kept its promise to remember them. By winter's end, there was almost no one left to send. The bases stood half empty, the docks lined with rusting boats that would never sail again. The few that remained at sea drifted through cold grey waters, far from home, unseen and unhearing. Each transmission that reached headquarters felt like a voice calling from another world. When silence followed, as it always did, the names were marked off, one by one, in ledgers that no longer shocked anyone. The war beneath the waves was ending not with surrender, but with disappearance. The ocean, vast and indifferent, absorbed them into its endless blue, as if erasing the memory of what had once dared to challenge it. In their final moments, perhaps some imagined sunlight on water, or the sound of wind through grass. And beyond those thoughts waited only peace, the cold, endless peace of the deep, where even memory fades into stillness. Long after the war's end, the Atlantic continued to whisper stories that no one could fully explain. The ocean had kept its secrets well, folding them deep into currents that moved with the same ancient patience that had once carried the U-boats across its breadth. Dozens of vessels had vanished without trace. No distress calls, no wreckage, not even the brief flare of an SOS against the night. They were simply gone, their names crossed out in silence, their coordinates guessed but never confirmed. The families waited at first, then stopped waiting, leaving only unanswered questions behind. Historians would later call them mysteries of war, but the men who had known the sea called them something simpler. Debts collected by the deep. Sometimes sailors on later voyages claimed to hear faint signals on forgotten frequencies, rhythmic and haunting, like echoes that had never learned how to stop. Whether real or imagined, such stories became part of the ocean's folklore. And in that folklore, the lost found a kind of second life, one that never surfaced. Among the most famous of these vanished boats was desaparecidos, as some researchers called them collectively, a fleet within the fleet that existed only in rumor and memory. Disappeared in calm weather somewhere off the Azores. Her last transmission a single, incomplete word, pressure, followed by static that stretched into silence. Another U-972 was last seen leaving Saint-Nazaire, her captain noted for his precision, her engines newly serviced, her crew experienced and steady. Nothing was ever found. Even the seabed beneath her supposed route showed no scars, no twisted steel. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the ocean. For divers and researchers who came decades later, such vanishings held a quiet pull, the lure of ghosts too deep to disturb. Theories would come and go: mechanical failure, air leaks, mines, sabotage, even magnetic anomalies, yet none could explain the sheer completeness of disappearance. For the sea does not lose things, it keeps them where we cannot follow. In the years that followed the war, sonar maps began to reveal the faint outlines of wrecks scattered across the Atlantic floor. Some were found upright, their decks intact, as though frozen mid-patrol. Others lay broken, half buried in silt, their numbers erased by time. Divers who reached them spoke of strange stillness, a silence so deep it pressed against the ears like a held breath. Inside, the compartments were filled not with death, but with absence. Papers still sat in drawers, cups rested where they had been left. In some boats, the light from submersible lamps revealed things untouched: a pen fallen beside a logbook, a uniform folded neatly in a locker. It was as if the men had stepped away only moments before. And in that illusion of presence, the deep revealed its most haunting mercy, to preserve what it takes. Stories spread among sailors and scientists alike of strange readings on sonar, faint pings that moved too slowly to be whales, too rhythmically to be chants. They came and went, often near known wreck sites, repeating patterns that resembled Morse code but carried no meaning anyone could decipher. Some dismissed them as anomalies, echoes from shifting seabeds, or the metallic sighs of pressure against aging hulls. Others, quieter and more poetic, called them ghost signals, the last transmissions of machines that refused to stop obeying orders. The truth was unknowable, and perhaps that was what made it endure. The sea is full of sound, and sometimes memory disguises itself as noise. For those who listened late at night, the signals felt like whispers from a world just beneath this one, a reminder that not everything lost stays silent. And so, the Atlantic became both grave and archive, keeper of its own unending symphony. When divers finally reached the wreck of U-534 in the late 20th century, they found it astonishingly preserved. She lay tilted on her side in the mud, her hull largely intact, her interior sealed tight by decades of pressure. Among her remains were maps of routes that no longer mattered, messages written in careful script, and personal belongings that spoke softly of youth and habit. A razor, a pipe, a chess piece still resting on a board. Some of the crew had been trapped when the submarine sank, their final positions frozen in gesture, hands still near valves and controls. Yet there was no violence in their preservation, only stillness, a kind of unbroken dignity. The divers left quietly, speaking little as they rose through layers of fading light. What they had seen was not tragedy, but time itself, sleeping beneath the waves. And time, once it sleeps in the ocean, rarely wakes again. In the archives of naval intelligence, Records once deemed irrelevant began to reappear. Intercepted transmissions, incomplete logs, and vague reports of unknown contacts at sea filled drawers that had been forgotten. Historians pieced together timelines like fragments of a dream, dates, coordinates, names half erased by salt and ink. What emerged was less a map of movement and more a constellation of disappearances scattered across both hemispheres. Some of these coordinates would later align with wrecks discovered by sonar, others remained empty, stubbornly unyielding. In those blank spaces, imagination flourished, and with it, reverence. For even science finds humility in the face of absence. There are things that facts can measure, and things they can only circle endlessly, like ships in fog. And in that circling, memory learns to live without answers. Today, when research vessels pass over the mid-Atlantic ridge, their instruments still detect faint metallic echoes deep below. Some belong to known wrecks. Others appear and vanish like shadows moving beneath shifting clouds. The ocean floor, shaped by time and silence, keeps its geography fluid, its secrets layered and alive. Each generation of explorers brings new technology, brighter light, sharper sonar, yet the results remain hauntingly incomplete. For every wreck identified, another mystery rises in its place, another question that the sea will not let go. Perhaps the truth is simple, that the ocean, vast and sentient in its patience, does not surrender what it takes. It allows glimpses, never explanations, and so the names of the vanished remain suspended between history and myth, between data and dream. And the dream, like the tide, returns each time we listen closely enough. In the end, the story of the vanished U-boats is not about technology, or failure, or even war. It is about silence, the silence that follows when men and machines reach the edge of what can be known. Somewhere, far below, their steel hulls rest in eternal twilight, untouched by light or sound, surrounded by the slow drift of silt that covers all things in time. Their instruments are long dead, yet their presence hums faintly through the water, not as ghosts, but as memory, carried by the endless rhythm of the sea. They remain part of the Atlantic's pulse, woven into its quiet breathing, its long, patient history. The war ended, the nations changed, but the ocean stayed the same, vast and impartial, keeping its own counsel. And perhaps that is fitting, that the last voices of the deep belong not to victory or defeat, but to endurance itself. And in that endurance, the sea whispers the way forward, towards surrender, and the fall of the empire that dreamed of ruling it. In May of 1945, the war that had swallowed the world finally began to fade into silence. Cities lay in ruin, fields turned to ash, and the great machines of war had grown weary of their own noise. In the northern harbors of Germany, the remaining U-boats rocked gently in the tide, their decks glistening with salt and rain. The men who tended them moved with slow precision, as if trapped between memory and disbelief. They knew the end had come. They had heard it in the voices of their commanders, seen it in the letters that no longer arrived. For months, they had been fighting a war already lost, carried forward by inertia and obedience. Now that movement was slowing, each order softer than the one before. The sea, which had been their constant companion, seemed to grow stiller too, as though listening for the final word. And soon, that word would come, spoken not in victory, but in release. Karl Dönitz, now Reich president for a Germany that no longer existed, sat at his desk in Flensburg, surrounded by maps that had lost their meaning. The man who had once commanded an empire beneath the waves found himself in charge of a nation, reduced to fragments and surrender. His last days as leader were not marked by rage or defiance, but by a strange, heavy calm. He wrote his final orders in precise handwriting, the same deliberate style he had used for years, neat, methodical, controlled. His words carried none of the language of conquest, only duty. All U-boats are to cease offensive operations, he wrote, and surrender to the nearest Allied authority. The message would travel farther than any he had ever sent, carried by voices and signals that still echoed across the sea. It was an end without ceremony, an empire dissolving with the press of a key. And with that signal, the deep began to grow quiet again. Across the Atlantic and the North Sea, the order arrived in fragments of static. Cease fire. Surface. Surrender. Some crews listened in silence, staring at the radio as if the words might change if they waited long enough. Others looked at their captain, searching his face for permission to believe what they had just heard. A few wept softly, though none could say whether it was for relief or grief. Slowly, one by one, the submarines began to rise, black shapes breaking the surface of the water like ghosts returning from the deep. The hatches opened, and pale faces met the wind again, their eyes squinting at sunlight they had long forgotten. The air smelled of salt and spring, but also of finality. No torpedoes, no alarms, only the sound of waves brushing gently against steel. And in that sound, the long echo of war began to fade. Allied ships moved toward the surfacing submarines cautiously, their guns lowered but not yet at rest. The men on both sides regarded one another with the same quiet disbelief, as though waking from the same dream. The U-boat crews stood on deck, hands raised or resting on rails, the wind tugging at their worn uniforms. Many were no older than the sailors sent to receive them, their faces thin, their expressions emptied of everything but fatigue. In that shared silence the war seemed smaller, not gone, but reduced to something human again. Flags were lowered, orders exchanged, and the great surrender of the underwater fleet unfolded not in chaos, but in eerie calm. Some of the Allied sailors said later that they had never seen the ocean so still. It was as if the sea itself had grown tired of holding its breath, and for the first time in years it exhaled. The days that followed were filled with motion, a slow, methodical unweaving of the world the U-boats had built. Crews disembarked, carrying what few belongings they had left. Logbooks were surrendered, engines shut down, weapons sealed. On the docks, long lines of sailors stood waiting, their shadows stretching across the concrete like ripples of memory. Some sang softly to themselves. Others simply watched the horizon, unwilling to turn their backs on it. For them the sea was not enemy or ally. It was home, and leaving it felt like betrayal. The Allied officers treated them with the restrained respect due to men who had fought an impossible war beneath an indifferent ocean. No cheers marked the end, only a quiet acknowledgement between survivors of opposing sides. And in that mutual silence the sea's final lesson took shape, that endurance is its own kind of surrender. In Flensburg, Dönitz received confirmation that the last U-boat had surfaced. His aide read the report aloud, voice unsteady in the still air. For a long moment the Admiral said nothing. Then he nodded, folded the document and placed it beside the others. There were no speeches, no gestures of defiance. Only a man who had built his life on discipline facing the truth that even the sea could not save what men had undone. He looked out the window, toward a horizon he could no longer command. Perhaps he thought of the thousands who had gone beneath those waters and never returned. Perhaps he thought of the silence he had always loved, the same silence that now stretched before him, vast and final. And in that silence, the Admiral of the deep ceased to be its master, and became its memory. The surrendered submarines were escorted to ports across Britain, Canada, and the United States. Some were studied, others dismantled, their technology absorbed by nations that had once feared them. A few were scuttled intentionally, sent to the bottom as if to reunite them with their fallen kin. Divers who later explored them found no sense of defeat in their remains, only quiet craftsmanship, the mark of men who had believed deeply in the art of endurance. The sea accepted their return without judgment, folding them once more into its cold embrace. Above, the world moved on, busy rebuilding itself, forgetting the invisible war that had raged beneath its surface. But the ocean never forgets. Its memory is long measured not in years, but in the slow drift of sand and salt. And beneath that memory, the story of the U-boats rested at last. When the last orders were filed away, and the radios fell silent, the age of the U-boat truly ended. The sea returned to what it had always been, endless, patient, unknowable. The men who survived carried its sound with them for the rest of their lives, hearing it even in quiet rooms, the hum of engines, the sigh of pressure, the heartbeat of the deep. Dönitz lived out his years in solitude, the ocean still visible in the distance, yet forever out of reach. The submarines became relics, and then memories, and finally, myths. The war beneath the waves was over, but its echo would linger wherever wind met water. For in the end, the sea keeps no loyalties, only stories. And one of those stories was not yet done, for among the surrendered boats, one carried a secret that refused to die, the myth of U-977 and the voyage to nowhere. When the guns fell silent and the flags were lowered, the captains of the deep returned to a world that no longer recognized them. The sea, which had once obeyed their will, now belonged to no one. Their names, once whispered with both reverence and fear, began to dissolve into the air, like mist at dawn. Some were brought before tribunals, others quietly vanished into civilian life, their uniforms folded away in drawers that would never again be opened. The governments that had praised them now avoided their memory, embarrassed by the devotion they had once inspired. For the victors they were relics of cruelty, for their own people reminders of a faith too absolute. They lived between worlds, not heroes, not villains, merely men displaced by the ending of a myth. The ocean had released them, but the land offered no home, and so they drifted once more, though this time through time itself, rather than water. Karl Dönitz, the Admiral who had dreamed of a navy made of shadows, was tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to prison. He faced his judges with the same calm that had defined his command, his words measured, his gaze steady. He spoke not of ideology, but of duty, of obedience to law and chain of command. Some saw dignity in it, others evasion. For 10 years he lived behind stone walls, his world reduced to memory and routine. When he was released, he returned to a modest home near the Baltic, where the sound of the sea could still be heard in the distance. Visitors described him as courteous, reserved, and unchanged, as though a part of him had remained submerged. He wrote his memoirs, defending the men who had served under him, insisting that they were soldiers, not monsters. Yet even in his defense there was weariness, the knowledge that time does not absolve, it only buries. And the tide of history, like the real sea, buried quietly but without remorse. Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, Engelbert Endres, names that had once filled newspapers with pride and fear, each had embodied the spirit of the wolves, daring and precise, bound to the sea, as if by oath, but their stories ended long before the war did. Prien vanished in 1941, his U-47 swallowed whole in the North Atlantic. his final fate never confirmed. Endrus followed the next year, his submarine breaking apart beneath the waves near Portugal. Kretschmer survived, captured after his own boat was destroyed, spending years in captivity in Britain. When he returned to Germany after the war, he chose silence over remembrance. The sea had given him immortality in legend, but the world above had moved on. To speak of those days, even with pride, felt like reopening a wound that had already healed without them. And so the legends of the Wolfpack became stories told only by the wind and the water. In quiet coastal towns across Europe, former U-boat officers lived ordinary lives under false names or forgotten ones. Some became fishermen, their hands once used to guide torpedoes, now hauling nets heavy with herring. Others turned to teaching, engineering, or simple solitude. At night, they would stand by the shore, staring out toward the same horizon they had once commanded. The sea never left them. It whispered in their dreams, its pressure still in their bones, its silence still in their ears. They rarely spoke of the war. When they did, it was with a tone that mixed nostalgia with regret, pride with sorrow. They were men who had seen both mastery and ruin, and carried both with quiet dignity. And the ocean, patient as ever, listened to them all, keeping their secrets in its depths. The world, meanwhile, learned to forget them. Nations rebuilt, histories were rewritten, and the stories of the U-boats became reduced to statistics. Tonnage sunk, numbers lost, victories tallied like ledger entries. The men behind those numbers faded into abstraction. Even the great victories, like Scapa Flow or the Happy Time, became paragraphs in textbooks, stripped of their human texture. Only the veterans remembered the smell of diesel, the low hum of engines, the creak of pressure at 1,000 feet. To most they were symbols of a war long past. To themselves they remained part of something living and unfinished. The silence of peace had made them ghosts in their own country, exiled not by force but by time. And time, unlike the ocean, never gives back what it takes. A few tried to tell their stories, to reclaim some measure of truth from the myths that had grown around them. Books were written, interviews given, letters exchanged with historians who sought understanding rather than judgment. Some accounts were defiant, others deeply sorrowful. One old captain wrote, "We believed the sea would forgive us, but the sea forgives no one. It only remembers differently." His words captured what many felt but could not say aloud. They were not asking for sympathy, only for recognition, that they had lived and lost and endured. Yet the world prefers simpler narratives, villains and heroes, victors and defeated. There was no place for men who had been both, and so their voices drifted back into silence, like signals fading into static. By the 1960s, the last reunions of the U-boat veterans began to dwindle. They met in seaside cafes, sharing photographs and toasts, their numbers smaller each year. Their laughter carried a trace of salt and age, and when they spoke of the past, it was always softly, as though the sea itself might overhear. Some wore medals tucked discreetly beneath their jackets. Others wore none at all. The conversations were never about politics, only about weather, machinery, and the names of those who had not returned. There was affection there, and a kind of melancholy acceptance that memory itself was slipping away. The ocean outside their windows was calm, endless, familiar. It no longer frightened them, and in that calm they saw not their past, but their reflection, quiet, small, enduring. When the last of the captains passed, their names barely made the newspapers. Their medals were boxed and auctioned, their memoirs left unread, their graves marked simply by stone and lichen. Yet beneath the waves, Their legacy endures in silence. In the wrecks that still rest upon the ocean floor, in the faint hum of stories that never stopped echoing through the deep. History may forget faces, but the sea remembers movement, pressure, and promise. Somewhere far below, the remnants of their command still lie in perfect stillness, a testament not to conquest, but to the fragility of mastery itself. They had ruled the sea once, and then the sea ruled them, and perhaps that was how it was always meant to be. For beyond their silence, another story awaited, of those who would chase their ghosts across the cold, unending water, the searchers and divers of a new century. The ocean remembers everything. It does not speak in words or stories, but in the language of slow corrosion and quiet preservation. Each current carries fragments of the past, a rivet, a plate, a coil of wire, a whisper of what once lived in the dark. Modern explorers come with technology that can see where human eyes cannot, their lights piercing centuries of shadow. They descend through layers of water that have not been disturbed since the last breath of the men who once called it home. The deeper they go, the quieter the world becomes, until even thought seems to move in rhythm with the sea's slow heartbeat. Sonar outlines appear like ghosts on screens, familiar shapes half buried, resting in silt and memory. These are not ruins, but remnants of purpose, waiting to be seen again. Each wreck is both monument and question, its silence thicker than time itself, and in that silence the ocean tells its story without words. When the first divers found the resting place of U-352 off the coast of North Carolina, they spoke of an overwhelming stillness. The submarine lay on her side, her hull torn but her dignity intact, as though simply pausing in eternal rest. Fish darted through the open hatches, their scales flashing in the light like fleeting sparks of life among the dead. Coral had begun to grow along the railings, turning rust into a kind of soft, organic bloom. The ocean had not destroyed her. It had absorbed her, folded her gently into its rhythm, their hands brushing against metal that once trembled with engines and human breath. They said it felt as though the boat was watching them, not accusingly, but with patience. When they surfaced, the sound of waves felt different, as if they had surfaced through time itself. And above the waves, the air carried the faint echo of the deep below. Other wrecks followed, U-166 in the Gulf of Mexico, found by oil surveyors who stumbled upon history while searching for the present. U-576 off Cape Hatteras, her story reconstructed piece by piece from the currents that had hidden her for decades. In the North Sea, U-534 was raised, her body bruised but still recognizable, a steel monument to the men who had once believed the sea could be mastered. In Norway, the cold fjords yielded their secrets too, each discovery another verse in the ocean's long requiem. The explorers who found them were not treasure hunters, but listeners. They understood that the ocean is both grave and library, keeper of what humanity tries to forget. To dive was not to conquer, but to understand the patience of water and the permanence of loss. And with each discovery, the Atlantic seemed to exhale a little more of its history. The divers spoke often of the quiet, not the absence of sound, but a fullness, a living silence that seemed to vibrate through the suit, the tank, the heartbeat. In that space, they said, time felt elastic. The war was not 70 years gone, but hovering just out of sight, its outlines drawn in silt and shadow. They could almost hear the faint hum of engines that no longer worked, or the soft thud of tools against steel. It was as if the sea, unwilling to forget, replayed the last moments of those voyages in an endless loop beneath its waves. Some divers left small tokens, a coin, a patch, a folded note. Others simply touched the hull and drifted upward, unwilling to break the spell. And the sea, eternal and unmoved, kept listening to the living who came to remember the dead. On land the memorials began to appear. In Kiel, where it had all begun, a tall tower looked out over the Baltic, a monument of stone and silence. Inside, candles burned beneath names etched in bronze, boats, numbers, years. Visitors spoke in whispers, their footsteps echoing against the walls like the faint rhythm of waves. Families who had waited decades brought flowers for those who had no graves, only coordinates. The wind outside carried the scent of salt and old steel, mingling the living and the lost. Across the world, in Liverpool, in La Rochelle, in Lorient, similar memorials stood, quiet reminders that the sea holds its own kind of peace. There were no flags, no symbols of victory, only memory. And memory, when tended softly, becomes something sacred. Modern technology has made the ocean more visible than ever, yet its mysteries remain intact. Remote submersibles glide over wrecks with mechanical grace, their lights illuminating fragments of a forgotten world. They capture images of gauges still frozen at depth, of logbooks waterlogged but legible, of porcelain mugs resting on silent tables. Each object feels intimate, ordinary, heartbreakingly human. Historians read these details not as evidence of defeat, but as traces of endurance, proof that even in despair, life insists on order. The submarines themselves have become museums of memory, open only to the sea. No diver or machine can disturb their quiet completely. They remain as they were in their final moments, complete, enclosed, at rest. And the ocean, patient as always, guards them with its boundless calm. For those who dive, it becomes less about discovery and more about communion. They describe a strange sense of kinship, not with nations or wars, but with the sea itself. The deeper they go, the more human distinctions blur. There are no sides in silence, no enemies in the dark. Each dive feels like a pilgrimage, each ascent like waking from a dream. The water presses against them, not harshly, but insistently, reminding them that everything man builds will one day return here. The U-boats, resting now as part of that great cycle, have lost their menace and gained their meaning. They are no longer symbols of conquest, but of return, of what it means to belong, finally, to something greater than oneself. And in that return, the sea becomes not a grave, but a keeper of peace. Today the ocean still holds them, hundreds of silent shapes scattered across the world's cold waters, their outlines softened by time. Scientists study them, divers honor them, and the sea continues its endless work of remembrance. The stories they tell are no longer of war, but of patience, of endurance, of the quiet reconciliation between man and nature. Every tide that passes over them writes another line of an unending elegy. Every current that flows through their empty corridors carries whispers of names that will never fully fade. The Atlantic has become both witness and sanctuary, both end and beginning. And perhaps that is fitting, for in remembering them we remember ourselves, fragile, hopeful, and temporary. And far beneath those waves, the last light of memory flickers on, guiding us toward the ocean's final lesson, that nothing is ever truly lost. The sea, once the stage of thunder and fire, has returned to stillness. Its surface gleams beneath shifting clouds, endless and eternal, giving no hint of what lies beneath. But below that calm skin, the remnants of a vanished war sleep in perfect silence. The U-boats rest as they fell, undisturbed, their steel softened by time and salt, Around them drift the slow-moving creatures of the deep, unknowing, unbothered, and utterly at peace. No human sound reaches them now, only the steady whisper of currents threading through their empty corridors. The war that once roared above has dissolved into memory, and memory into myth. The ocean has reclaimed what was once taken from it, leaving behind only the faint echo of courage, fear, and endurance. Each wreck is a page in the sea's quiet chronicle, written not in ink, but in rust and stillness. And in that stillness, the story begins to fade, yet never truly ends. For those who listen closely, the sea still hums with the faint memory of men who once dreamed of mastery. They came not to conquer the ocean, but to dwell within it, believing they could bend its will through discipline and design. Yet the ocean is older than ambition, older than the dreams of any empire. It accepts all things and resists none, offering calm even as it claims what it must. The men who sailed those steel coffins believed they could outthink the sea, but in the end they became part of it. Their courage was not in defiance, but in endurance, in their willingness to face the deep and trust it would let them return. Some did, most did not. The ocean remembers them all the same, for the sea does not distinguish between victory and defeat. It remembers only presence. And through that presence, it keeps the truth of their story alive beneath the waves. Above the surface, the world has changed. Cities have risen and fallen, borders redrawn, and the sound of war replaced by the hum of commerce and conversation. Yet beneath the endless blue, the past continues, untouched, unaging. The deep keeps no time, no history. It carries only weight and silence. Modern ships sail over the same waters where U-boats once hunted, their captains unaware of the steel shadows sleeping below. The radar screens flicker, the engines hum, and life moves on. But the sea does not forget. It carries the memory of each ship, each storm, each soul that sank into its depths, and in that continuity lies something eternal, the quiet reminder that memory outlives memory keepers. And so the ocean remains, both guardian and grave, both silence and song. Those who dive into these waters now do not descend as soldiers, but as witnesses. They move carefully, reverently, through the still corridors of the sunken boats. Their lights reveal not horror, but history. A folded uniform, a rusted compass, the fragile outline of a cup still resting where it was placed. In those frozen details, time folds inward. The divers emerge with faces pale, not from fear but from awe. They say the air inside those wrecks feels heavier, as if it still remembers breathing. The deep seems alive with memory, gentle but watchful. Each dive becomes a communion between past and present, between what was and what remains. And as they rise again toward the light, the ocean closes quietly, keeping its secrets undisturbed. There is a strange comfort in knowing that the sea remembers what men forget. It holds no judgment, only recollection. The wrecks of the U-boats lie side by side with those of merchant ships and destroyers, their distinctions long erased. Once they were enemies, now they share the same resting place, bound by salt and silence. The ocean equalizes all things, turning history into harmony. What was once victory or loss becomes simply presence, a continuation in stillness. In the eyes of the sea, there are no victors, only returnees. Each wave above is a breath of remembrance, each current below a soft movement through memory. The war has ended, but its echoes remain gentle and unbroken. And in those echoes, the sea whispers that all endings are simply returns. On shore, memorials stand in quiet symmetry, with the calm beyond them. In Kiel, Orléans, Saint-Nazaire, and Liverpool, names are carved into stone that looks out toward the same horizon those men once followed. Visitors walk slowly, speaking in low tones, their footsteps muffled by grass and wind. The ocean glimmers beyond, infinite, patient, and listening. Flowers fall into the tide and drift outward, carried toward unseen depths. Somewhere below, those gestures meet their intended, not in body, but in spirit. The living remember through ritual, the sea through silence, and between them lies understanding that remembrance is not about holding on, but about letting go with grace. And as the wind moves over the water, it carries those names once more into the world. Time in its long sweep will erase even the memory of the war that birthed these iron ghosts. The steel will crumble, the salt will consume, and the sea will reclaim its minerals grain by grain. Yet the essence of their story will remain, not as fact or record, but as feeling the quiet courage of men in impossible places, the hum of engines beneath miles of water, the thin line between fear and faith. These are not things that can be measured, only remembered. The ocean carries them forward, weaving them into the eternal rhythm of tide and current. It asks for nothing and gives everything back in whispers. The sea is both the keeper and the confessor of all who cross it, and its memory, unlike ours, never fades with time. It deepens. Now when the night falls over the Atlantic, and the wind moves softly across its vastness, it is said that the sea still sings, not in words but in tone, low and unbroken. Somewhere in that quiet music, the memory of the U-boat aces drifts like light through water. They are no longer warriors, no longer hunted, no longer lost. They are part of the ocean now, part of the eternal stillness that watches empires rise and fall, and yet remains unchanged. The waves that once carried them to war now carry only peace. And beneath those waves, the deep continues its endless meditation, its long remembering. The sea, vast and forgiving, has kept its promise to hold them forever. Long after empires fade and flags are forgotten, the deep still remembers. And in that endless quiet the U-boat aces sleep.